Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Joseph Atick, Executive Chairman of ID for Africa, and this is our 23rd LiveCast. Whether you are new to the series or a regular fan of the LiveCasts, I'd like to warmly welcome you to this episode. Thanks for taking the time to be with us as we kick off part one of our trilogy on the dark side of identity, mitigating the risks. This is a topic that has generated unprecedented level of interest in response to our call for speakers, so much so that we had to dedicate to it 3 episodes to allow as many perspectives as possible to be expressed and to stimulate a constructive dialogue. In preparation for this series, we interviewed over 70 potential participants, and what has become clear is that the elevated concern is caused by the convergence of several factors, aggravated by the lack of understanding about how identity systems could be made responsible, and by the absence of open and transparent dialogue. To set the stage for the trilogy, perhaps it's helpful to briefly highlight some of the common threads we observed in these interviews. First, the number one development that evokes the highest concern seems to be the proliferation of digital population registers around the world. These registers are seen as aggregating and centralizing significant amount of data about individuals, and in the absence of understanding how they are used to empower people and how they could be protected from abuse, invariably the view is tainted by the colors of risk. To the critics, personally identifying information when centralized in data banks will necessarily attract hacking and breaches and abuse by state actors in context with weak governance. Second, the emergence of the unique identity number as a single identifier that can link information across sectors and data exhausts from identity-enabled use is viewed by many as a major menace, as it could lead to profiling and surveillance of the population. Once again, in the absence of designs and governance to make such eventuality very difficult. A third factor is the digital transformation itself of the human experience that we are witnessing right now all over the world. Digital identity is at the core of this global societal transformation, and it is increasingly becoming essential for anyone to function in a world that is digital and actionable from a distance. This raises exclusion risks and potential violations of social and human rights if the barriers to entry into the new digital regime are not eliminated. A related concern arises from a belief that certain biometric technologies, inappropriately used in digital ID systems, exhibit certain inherent demographic bias. A fourth factor that recurred during the interviews is the risk of IT and ID systems falling outside their original scope of governance. For example, due to political instabilities and power change. While fragility and regime instabilities are nothing new in world history, what is new is the fact that they are now happening in the digital age, where powerful government IT systems designed for public good risk being redirected to nefarious ends by new regime. There are several more concerns expressed, and we shall tackle a significant number of them throughout the trilogy. In our assessment, none of these are new. The development community has been aware of most of them and has worked together to come up with responsible guidelines, which are encapsulated in the principles of identification for development, a good first achievement and a useful foundation. But the perceived scale of the current menace and the lingering level of anxiety suggests that the principles are not enough for ID4D. Among what we heard were lacking are mechanisms for audit and compliance, better transparency and recourse, and designs for hardening of information systems so they could resist attempts to use them for harm even when they fall in the wrong hands. Topics we intend to explore in this series. This is the context within which we are launching this trilogy. Our objective is to explore the landscape of concerns, give voice to everyone, promote a positive dialogue to enhance trust among the stakeholders, and explore frameworks, designs, and other guardrails that hold promise for mitigating the risks so that ID systems can only be a force for good. I appeal to everyone to join us in good faith in this most difficult mission. We acknowledge the topic is vast and has thus far been divisive, but you have my commitment that ID for Africa will treat this topic with the highest standards of fairness and accuracy. We will respect everyone's right to voice their opinions as long as they have a factual basis and they respect the opinions of others. Please consult our LiveCast participation policy, which governs responsible engagements within this forum, including the chat, Q&A, and community voices. The link is in the chat. So stay with us for this exceptional series where everyone will be a winner if we arrive at laying the foundation for positive dialogue. Let me share with you the lineup and the topics that made it into the program after significant deliberations. Let's start with today's episode. In fact, today's episode will have 6 interesting segments. The first segment, we will do a fascinating documentary, a video documentary. The second, we are sharing the results of rights and risks assessment of ID systems of 10 African nations. Then we will have a feature presentation, something exceptional, about recent data about the impact of race and gender on biometric performance. Then we will come to the heart of the discussion with a panel on exclusion, understanding the root causes of exclusion. Then I will have a one-on-one discussion with the new executive director of NIRA, Uganda. And then we will end with a very, very positive and uplifting panel on overcoming exclusion with case studies from IOM, Brazil, and Kenya. So this is an exceptional. Can we move on to the next panel to share with you? Not only are we sharing with you today's episode, but we're also revealing and unveiling the lineup for the December 1st episode. You could see we're taking a different approach. So in this case, what we're doing is we're starting the episode with a multi-view perspective of experts who are going to basically give us what they see as the issues related to the most important element, which is the data risks. So then that would be followed by something we call the trialogue, which is a discussion that I'm going to have with 2 experts about what happens when ID systems are built within a fragile environment, fall in the wrong hands, etc. What can we do about them? What does history tell us and show us? And so we will have an interesting discussion about that. Then we are going to follow that by a segment where representatives of Access Now and NIMSI will debate the facts and myths of identity systems. We're hoping to demonstrate the value of open dialogue between parties that do not necessarily see eye to eye a priori, but who are aligned in their commitment to do good and hence will engage in respectful dialogue to try to bridge the gap. So we call this episode Bridging the Gap. Part 3 of this series will be on December 15 and will be a technology forum where we will talk within multiple segments with innovators about their ideas to harden identity systems and render them responsible by design. You do not want to miss the season 3 finale. We will announce the lineup for it on December 1st. Before we start today's episode, I'd like to thank our development partners, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, for their continued support of our LiveCasts. It is through their patronage that we can bring you unbiased quality LiveCast productions. I also like to call upon all of you to support your movement's work by liking, sharing, and subscribing to the YouTube channel. Finally, as I had mentioned in the previous episode, the Eye on Africa segments will return in the new year. In fact, they will return on January 26th. For now, I invite you to watch the replays on YouTube if you have missed them. In season 3, we have done in-depth reports on 8 African identity systems. And as a bonus, I did an executive summary of the lessons learned from those 8 reports. We call it Africa ID Report 2021. Check it out in replay, please. We're now ready to welcome the full participants in this episode. With us today, we're pleased to have, in the order of appearance in the episode, Pam Dixon, Executive Director, World Privacy Forum, USA. Amber Sinha was scheduled to be with us. He's from the Executive Director from the Center for Internet and Society, India, but due to health reasons, he was unable to be with us. We're pleased to have with us his colleague, Yesha Tshering Paul, Program Officer at the Center for Internet and Society, India. Dr. Yevgeniy Sirotin, Technical Director, SAIC's Identity and Data Sciences Laboratory in Washington, USA. Christian Van Veen, Director of Digital Welfare State and Human Rights Project, NYU Law. I think Christian will be with us in the program shortly. Caitlin Shofi, who's the research scholar, Digital Welfare State and Human Rights Project, NYU Law, who's joining us from the UK. Dorothy Mukasa, team leader, Unwanted Witness, Uganda. Rosemary Kisembo, Executive Director, National Identification and Registration Authority of Uganda, NIRA. Janaina Costa, Senior Researcher, Institute of Technology and Society, ITS, Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Mustafa Mahmoud, Senior Program Manager, Namati, Kenya. And Sai Winter, Senior Regional Thematic Specialist for the International Organization for Migration, IOM. I've lost my breath just mentioning all these wonderful men and women. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your time and efforts to be with us in this important forum. We're going to be coming back to you one by one, but I will kick off this session by keeping Pam and removing everyone else from the panel. We'll bring them back as the segments progress. So, Pam, you are no stranger to the ID for Africa forums and platforms. You've been with us for several years now, and we thank you for your valuable help in helping us maintain and promote responsible dialogue with factual, multi-view perspectives. So I understand today, in preparation for this trilogy, you have you've been crisscrossing the world virtually, and you've done a documentary. You've been speaking to experts and influencers about what they see as their major concerns with identity systems. And so we would love to be to join you on this journey. So please take us forward to all the steps that you've made.
Joseph, thank you so much. Let's go ahead and cue the video. Thank you very much. It is my great pleasure today to travel with you on a tour around the world to hear from real people as they interact with identity systems in their country, in their region. The question we have asked on this tour is, what are the key problems that you see in identity systems in your region? Let us turn now to these voices from the field and hear what they have to say. We begin with Nanjala Niabola, a renowned writer, researcher, political analyst, and recipient of the 2021 Stanford Digital Civil Society Fellowship. She is based in Nairobi, Kenya, and has studied ID systems there extensively.
I think that it's important for people to remember that identity is not just a technical thing. It's also a political and it's a social thing. It's a determinant of political and social and economic outcomes. I feel like the current wave of interest in digital ID has disproportionately focused on the technical aspects and the economic outcomes. And we have insufficient understanding of the social and political dimensions of what it means to standardize people's identities according to metrics that maybe don't reflect how they see themselves and how they move in the world.
Now we turn to Fauzia Vikar to talk about identity systems in Southeast Asia. Fauzia is based in Pakistan, and she is a gender and inclusion advisor and policy expert.
So the identity systems in South Asia are still not inclusive of all the populations. We still have a problem of coverage because the foundational ID systems, like the national IDs or population registers are not inclusive of women. We recently found that the birth registrations of women, of girls, have gone down about 30% in one of the large provinces, which then automatically excludes them from CNIC and voter registration. This results in a denial of inheritance, which is based on identification of heirs. It also results in a denial of rights in marriage because of a lack of any official record. Problem is that most of our systems take a patrilineal view of identification, And the sex workers are also denied, the children of sex workers are also denied their rights because they don't have a father to report. These are some of the key issues on identity and the ID systems in Pakistan as well as in many parts of South Asia. One of the things that we need to do is to expand identification, make sure that every citizen is registered at birth, and then graduates to getting a national ID card and gets onto the voter register also. This will require better outreach and making the system more accessible to everyone, also removing the costs associated in terms of money as well as time with it. The second thing is to remove the requirement to have fathers, to make it necessary for fathers to be registered on that. And identity systems can go with the mother's name also. So the option should be there to improve that. A third suggestion, which is related not to these two groups, but to agriculture workers, for instance, is that biometrics often exclude agriculture workers, for example, whose thumb impressions cannot be taken. And for that, there has to be a different, a more sophisticated biometric system. It could be ocular also, and there are many other ways, which could help improve or expand the identification system.
Fawzia described problems with exclusion that agricultural workers can experience with ID systems and challenges with patrilineal approaches that can systemically exclude women. We turn now to Latin America, where we talk with Valeria Milanes, the executive director of ADC, a civil liberties NGO in Buenos Aires, Argentina, where Valeria is also based.
One thing that we are trying to highlight in our work on digital identity systems is the challenge that facial recognition, which is the technologies on which these systems are deployed, brings to the whole citizenship, to the people in general. It's well known that facial recognition systems are not good, are not fair with women, with people with disabilities, with people from the LGBTQ community, with the elderly. So that is something that concerns us a lot, because in most of our countries, data protection frameworks are weak, and they have no provisions to protect these settings, not facial recognition, not biometrics. So that is something that it should be really concerning and take care of if you are thinking on identification systems.
Valeria sees face recognition-based ID systems as a high priority problem in Latin America, specifically regarding issues to wide-ranging exclusion and unfairness. We turn now to India, which is well known for its Aadhaar identity ecosystem of more than 1 billion enrollees. As such, India is an important use case in the identity world. Anirban Sen, an attorney and masters of laws in New Delhi, India, is our voice from the field.
Because India has a large population, and how would you know who a person is? Because somebody's using a driving license, somebody's using a different voter ID, but the mobile number suddenly becomes something which everybody has. And most people will have just one number. So it's become very easy to track them and create profiles. And we don't know where these profiles actually exist. The dangers I'm sensing is, as more and more things are built on this system, then there has to be some duty to disclose how this information is being utilized. And if a person can use something else to get a better result. So yeah, 1, I have 2, and I have 3. Now it's not for any. Now this is not for a joke. It's just that mobile phones in India have become very cheap, and the operators cannot sustain themselves, and the networks are failing. So I literally have to have a number where at least I can make an outgoing call. I have a primary number, but the secondary number, that's where I realized that this identity systems are being built on these numbers.
Honor Bond's discussion of derived identity, in this case from mobile numbers, reminds us that derived identity creates new and complex problems with data governance, transparency, and other challenges that can lead to an unregulated ID ecosystem that risks losing the trust of the people it was designed to help. Next, we hear from Kay Turner in the United States. Kay is the senior counselor to the director of FinCEN at the US Department of the Treasury. FinCEN is the financial crimes enforcement network in the US.
Between February last year and June this year, FinCEN received more than 330,000 COVID-19 related suspicious activity reports, many involving compromised identity. We've seen significant reports of suspected government relief program fraud using stolen identities, where financial institutions recognize that the identity of the supposed recipient didn't match that of the account holder. Or business email compromise, where fraudsters pretend to be government employees or offering assistance in securing government funds with the help of witting or unwitting partners in crime, known as money mules. In response, FinCEN has trained law enforcement on emerging methodologies and alerted and issued alerts and advisories with risk indicators to banks. While these immediate measures might help, broader work securing identity systems is needed to combat all types of fraud.
It is striking to observe the way that the context of an identity system changes the balance and types of problems that can be experienced and encountered in that identity system. In the US, having legal identity is often taken for granted, but along with easily accessible ID has also come pronounced challenges with sophisticated forms of ID fraud. No system is without its challenges. Now let us turn again to Africa, where Wuri Mamadou Tamba Bari is the Chief Country Coordinator at Network Aid in Sierra Leone.
In Africa, the illiteracy rate is very high. And people, most times, very, very scary to enter a building of educated people. That, I'm illiterate, I don't read, I don't write. So what is the essence of birth certificate in my life in the first place? And how much money will it cost, for me to just go and get maybe a birth certificate, looking at their livelihood. So no one wants to spend maybe $5, $4, $10, $20 to take transport to get a birth certificate. No, it's an economic burden. So they will decide not to go, and they will stay. And secondly, the places where they are is surrounded. It's mostly surrounded by educated people, and for an illiterate individual to go and ask for birth certificates, it's prejudice on their own parts, that I don't need to go there, because the place is not accessible, it's not friendly. It's not, within their own community dispensation. And fast forward, stress on birth certificates, because birth certificate is the key. Without birth certificate, there's no need for you having a national identity.
Wuri's discussion of the barriers that illiteracy poses is a powerful reminder of Nanjala's words, that even if an identity system is built with perfect technology, obstacles outside of the ID system, such as illiteracy and the lack of a birth certificate, may have profound negative impacts and create exclusion. We turn now to two voices, Adan Farah and Habiba Abdi, both of whom are not able to get an ID, and both of whom live in Kenya. We begin with Adan Farah.
Without ID, you feel like a less Kenyan. Kama huwezi pata mahitaji yote ambayo unataka hapo Kenya, kila kona ukiingia wanakuuliza ID. Kila kona ukiingia wanakuuliza ID. That means utaona kwamba you are not part of Kenya.
Mzee wangu alikufa bila ID, alipata changamoto kwa miaka 3, na mimi nina hofu leo nikikufa bila kitambulisho, watoto wangu watakuja kupata tabu kwa maisha yao ya baadaye.
Services are increasingly being linked to identity and having an ID and being able to affirmatively prove your identity. This is true in Kenya and in most every country. As we have heard and seen, each country and region has its context for identity and its own problems with identity systems based on that context. There are, however, two things in common here. First, the biggest challenge of all in an ID system is if a person or a group of people have been excluded from being able to have an ID. And secondly, one of the biggest benefits of an ID system is if everyone can have an ID if they want it and use it with trust, easily and freely, confident in the system.
Na hizi ningeambia kuchukua ID, hiyo furaha yangu sijui ingekuwaje. Hiyo furaha ningekuwa na furaha kubwa sana. Kwa sababu kuambiwa kuja chukua ID ndio hii. That means your life has started.
Thank you, Pam. Thank you, Pam, for this enlightening journey. I remind everybody that many of the issues and topics that were raised in this mini documentary, will be addressed, and at least we'll hope to address them in this trilogy. Keeping in mind, one of the key takeaways from your documentary is that context matters. How and what priority we attribute to the risks and challenges and concerns is highly dependent on the context of the country or the region in which these systems are operating. Thank you once again, Pam. This is wonderful. We look forward to hearing from you again in a future engagement. We're now ready to have an exceptional presentation from Yesha Paul, who will talk about their findings in a study on rights and risks assessments of 10 African countries using a methodology that they've developed at the Center of Internet and Society in India. Yesha Tshering Paul is the program officer at the center, and she joins us from India. Yesha, the floor is yours.
Hi. Thank you, Dr. Atick. Unfortunately, my colleague Amber Sinha could not make it for this presentation. But in our presentation for today, we'll be talking about two things. One is we'll be introducing the evaluation framework for digital IDs that my organization CIS formulated in 2019. And after that, we will move on to a presentation of our findings from a series of 10 case studies that we conducted using the evaluation framework across 10 different countries in Africa. Next slide, please. Thank you. So for the evaluation framework for digital IDs, what we thought of it as, given the push for digital IDs across the world, and we've seen a lot of pushback and litigation as well because of the large number of concerns over this evaluation framework, what we thought would be useful would be to have an evaluation framework that can be used to evaluate these ID systems. So this evaluation framework, we hope for it to act as a sort of series of tests against which digital IDs may be tested. So of these tests, we have three kinds. We have rule of law tests, rights-based tests, and risk-based tests. Next slide, please. So after rule of law tests, these are the ones that we've come across. So basically what we're talking about is in terms of questions that we ask of these ID systems. One is there a law governing a digital ID, and is it a valid law? And does this law have a legitimate and clearly stated aim? Does the law clearly define the purposes for which the ID can be used, and also the actors which are in the ID ecosystem? Is the use of the ID system by private actors and public actors, but especially private actors, adequately regulated? Whether the law clearly defines the nature of data that will be collected by the ID system? Whether individuals have the right to access their data, whether they have the right to correct it or to opt out of the system completely? Whether there are adequate civil and criminal redressal systems in place to deal with violations of the rights of users of this ID, whether there is an independent regulatory mechanism to ensure accountability for the ID system, and also if there are newer purposes identified for the ID system which are different or extended from the original purpose, are there regulatory procedures in place to determine the legitimacy of these newer purposes? And that's to address the issue of mission creep. Next slide, please. Then we come to rights-based tests. So when we're talking about rights-based tests, we're looking at whether the principle of data minimization is followed in the collection, use, and retention of the personal data, whether the law specifies the access that various private and public actors have to personal data, and also whether the mandatory use of a digital ID leads to exclusionary impacts. And here, when we're talking about exclusions, we're talking about exclusions due to design flaws, and also exclusions due to failure of the ID system. Next slide, please. Then now we move on to risk-based tests, which is the third prong of the evaluation framework. In risk-based tests, we look at risk assessment. So whether the ID system has been regulated, taking into account all of the potential risks that could arise from implementation of the ID. Then we look at whether there is privacy risk mitigation and whether there's a national data protection law in place. And that's something we find that's often missing. We look at privacy by design. So are there privacy by design systems that minimize harms from potential data breaches? And also we look at the response to risks. So whether there's a mitigation strategy in place in case of failure or breach of the IT system. So these are the tests that ideally we would hope could be implemented during the implementation stage of an ID system, but also this can also be used to test ID systems that are already existing. Next slide, please. Okay, so the second part of this presentation is where we have taken this evaluation framework and we have applied it to evaluate 10 different foundational ID systems across Africa. Next slide, please. Yeah, so about this project, so CIS worked along with Research ICT Africa. And basically what we wanted to look at is if we could apply this evaluation framework to local and digitized and mostly digitized foundational ID systems in 10 countries. So we looked at Ghana, Kenya, Lesotho, Mozambique, Nigeria, Rwanda, South Africa, Tanzania, Uganda, and Zimbabwe. So we made sure to work with local research partners because obviously we sitting in India would not be aware of local country context and we would not be able to do justice to the matter. So what our research partners did was apply the evaluation framework and investigated the purpose of this project was basically to look at both sides of the digital identity coin, right? To see that the obvious benefits of a digital ID system, but also to investigate whether these ID systems also have adverse impacts. Yeah, next slide, please. So this is mostly where we talk about why we are sort of pushing for a critical analysis of any sort of digital ID system. ID systems by their very nature just create an inherent sort of power balance between the citizen and the state. And this is obviously because the large amounts of personal and sensitive data collected through these ID systems, and people often have no agency in what happens to this data. And this is further complicated by the fact that in many instances, there are private parties involved, and these private parties are often unregulated. So we've seen in a lot of the case studies that we did, not just in these countries in Africa, but also countries in India, countries in Asia and Europe as well. these digital IDs can also bring along their own risks along with the benefits. And I think a lot of these risks were covered, I think, in the documentary that we saw before this as well. So these would mostly be exclusions, profiling, surveillance, just off the top of my head. And basically what our evaluation framework seeks to ensure is that ID systems are designed from the outset as far as possible to prioritize rights and to make the most attempts to minimize adverse impacts as much as possible. Next slide, please. Yeah. So what we'll be talking about is, what I will be talking about is a sort of synthesis of 10 very extensive country reports. So obviously I can't go into a lot of detail about what each country report said. So what I will be doing is giving instances of the general observations and the trends that we've seen in this slide. So of the general observations, I think one of the first things that were sort of brought up by a lot of country partners is just the fact that the implementation of digital ID systems now seems to be sort of an extension of a colonial legacy of population control systems. And the impact of it, according to the observations of our researchers, seem to be fairly clear. So, I mean, we see examples of this, for example, in Mozambique, which had a population identification system that started in colonial times to separate like indigenous or assimilated national citizens from colonizers. And we've seen similar systems in Zimbabwe and Kenya as well. And there are concerns from local populations and local researchers that these coercive systems are now being pushed as the only solution to entrenched forms of poverty. And we just need, the suggestion was that we need to be a little critical and to take a step back from the promises of these solutions. The other concern that was raised was this push for digitization of identity, and particularly in the context that I mentioned previously. So we've seen examples, for example, in Kenya, literally it was described as pouring of new wine, like digital ID was pouring of new wine into old skins, which is the colonial ID. And the criticism against this push for digital ID has been that they often fail to address the entrenched challenges and legacy problems that lead to these issues in the first place. And they tend to act more of as a one-size-fits-all band-aid to address these solutions without addressing the foundational issues here. In Uganda, in fact, you see a sort of uneasy marriage between paper and digital systems. So this has apparently resulted in a system that at its core might be digital, but in actual practice is still very analog. Another problem that's been identified is a lack of a larger strategic vision when it comes to pushing these digital ID systems. So I think there are many parties involved in sort of trying to push digital ID systems on many countries, and in the sort of in the haste to implement these systems, there's no larger cohesive vision that seems to have been implemented. And so sometimes you have a very grand vision for digital ID systems, but then it has to contend with the reality of logistical failings, on the ground, like bureaucracy or infrastructural issues. And then you find another observation, however, a more positive observation was the identification of important policy windows. Because in Africa, I think almost every digital ID system in these countries is at various stages of implementation, but there's still plenty of opportunity for stakeholders, and I think most importantly, users of this ID to be involved in these discussions to help build an ID system that is as inclusive as possible. And another big concern in almost every ID system that we looked at was concerns around private actors in the ecosystem. So we see that formal and informal interactions between public and private actors is very often poorly regulated. And this could be in the form of public-private partnerships on the technical side of things when we come to building these ID systems. And then we also look at the access that private parties have to the data collected by ID systems. So these are the two aspects of private involvement that have been of much concern. And another issue is the lack of transparency that we see in these arrangements in many cases. And I think a notable example that was reported was in Zimbabwe, for example. There is apparently a controversial partnership between the government and a Chinese company for a facial recognition program. And there have been complaints of complete lack of transparency and public accountability about what is going to happen with this biometric data. And then finally, a massive issue, I mean, even in India, for example, is the risk of exclusions. So many countries that we've seen have made access to these digital IDs mandatory. And this is especially when it comes to accessing very basic like government services. And this means that if one does not have an ID, then one does not have access to very basic services. And in fact, in some countries, the lack of ID is criminalized. So it goes one step further. So we see instances where you can't collect rations, you can't have access to basic services or telecom or banking due to lack of ID. Next slide, please. So we now will be moving on to observations from these countries using the framework of the evaluation framework. Next slide, please. Okay, so these are the, I'll be moving on to the findings from rule of law tests. What we've seen is that most countries did seem to have some sort of enabling legislative framework to support the establishment of a digital ID system. I mean, this is a very different experience from what we had in India, where the Aadhaar system was rolled out in the absence of any sort of legislation. So that is one positive thing that we saw across most countries that we researched. However, in some countries, the digital ID system is being rolled out alongside a national data protection law, but the data protection law is not always implemented, or even if it is, it's quite broad. It's not always very effectively implemented. There have also been concerns around accessibility of these laws to the general population. So one concern, for example, in Lesotho was all the laws are written in English, and the act is not readily accessible. There's no electronic copies of the act available, and the cost of travel to obtain a copy of the law is high for the average citizen. So we see that though there might be a law, it is not in practice accessible at all. So then we see that in almost all the countries surveyed, private actors had access to some part of digital ID data. And levels of, can you move on to the next slide, please? Yeah. So private actors had access to personal data, and many country partners have reported concerns around the misuse of information by private parties and access to sensitive personal data for commercially exploitative purposes. So for instance, you have in Tanzania, where the Digital ID Authority gives public and private entities license through data sharing agreements to access personal data. And details of these agreements are not accessible to the public. So nobody knows what's happening. There's no transparency. There's no accountability in any of this. Then we also come to inadequate redressal mechanisms. So here we find that in a lot of countries, either there were redressal mechanisms didn't exist, or if there were redressal mechanisms, they were extremely tedious and very complicated and not very easily available to the average citizen. So in Nigeria, for example, the National Identity Management Commission doesn't provide any avenues for redressal for violation of the identity law. And however, there are, in some countries, our research partners found that there are other laws that, if they're read alongside, could provide some sort of solution. So for example, in Nigeria, our research partner found that this gap might be plugged to some extent by the Nigerian Data Protection Bill. In Mozambique, for example, is another example of a country where there is no redressal for violation of the law, and citizens have to avail remedies under different civil and criminal laws. So there's no specific law for redressal for any violations of your digital ID rights. Then we come to low levels of accountability and transparency within the system, where especially regarding the use of personal data and sharing with third parties, there were very few protections here. However, South Africa seems to have stood out as an exception. And I mean, at least on paper, it's adopted a sort of accountability framework for users. An extreme example that we've seen was Tanzania, where the regulator is permitted to enter into private data sharing arrangements with third parties, and they're under no legal obligation to provide the details. And what we found is that apparently 45 data sharing agreements have been executed between the regulator and third parties, and there is no clarity surrounding anything about the data. And then finally, we come to mission creep, which is usually arises due to the law containing broadly formulated purposes, and also in many instances, significant discretion given to the executive. So that's mostly due to the minister or to bureaucrats within the system. Next slide, please. Yeah. So then we come to findings from the rights-based tests. Here we're looking at, for example, in terms of data minimization, again, is a concern. there are many instances of a very broad trend of all of these digital ID systems collecting vast amounts of information that are not relevant at all to the stated purpose, and in many cases, vast amounts of biometric information, as we saw with Kenya and the Huduma number system. So, for example, Uganda, we see that there are vast amounts of sensitive information for registration purposes, including information that many would consider irrelevant, such as an individual's clan and ethnicity, and that's something that can actually be used against someone. Apparently, Ghana collects more than 30 different data points, including height, eye color, marital status, and Lesotho apparently collects about 23 data points. So we see that this is a huge problem in all of these ID systems. And all of this is usually carried out in the absence of any explicit rules for data minimization. Then we have access controls where there are no concrete legal frameworks for access to identity data. And we see that many companies have been allowed unfettered access to identity data. And then exclusions, exclusions, which is mostly arising out of a widespread tendency to make these ID systems mandatory. And other exclusions also arise from administrative or bureaucratic hurdles. We've seen sections that are disadvantaged due to the fact that they live in very remote locations. Maybe social issues like women, for example, or other groups might not be able to enroll. Sometimes it costs money to enroll for an ID. So these are other causes of exclusions. Next slide, please. Then we come from findings from risk-based, sorry, can you go to the previous slide? Risk-based tests. We found that there almost none of the countries had a publicly accessible risk assessment or framework, except for the exception of Nigeria, which apparently conducted a fairly comprehensive risk assessment, but did not take into account the risk of exclusions. We also found that many countries lack a governance framework that adequately addresses the risk involved in a digital ID system. So this is not regulated at all. And often, while the governing law may account for rights guaranteed by the Constitution or by other laws, they often fail to address inherent risks involved in a nationwide biometric system. Then again, we've seen a lack of recourse for authentication errors and no guidelines for recourse for this. And the absence of, obviously, of mitigation strategies to account for system failures we've seen in Lesotho. And in many cases, there's the absence of a well-implemented and effective data protection law to address any gaps. Next slide, please. So our final slide is basically, it talks about general recommendations where the opportunities that arise is one for a collaborative approach involving different stakeholders. And as we said, particularly intended beneficiaries of the ID system. Another important recommendation is to allow for analog and alternative forms of identification in order to account for infrastructural constraints, social issues, whatever reason why someone may not be able to either obtain a digital ID or authenticate their identity. Then the importance of avoiding mandatory use of digital ID, because that has been identified as a big source of exclusion. Then while formulating policies for digital ID, it is important to specifically account for vulnerable sections of the population while formulating policies. So, I mean, as we said, gender sensitivity and awareness. And also then the reports also have specific recommendations for different sectors, which I think we're a bit out of time for. Yes. Sorry.
Excellent. Yesha, this is a fascinating framework. I have two questions for you. In fact, is your formalism framework available for self-evaluation? Let's say a country or an identity authority says, we would like to actually see how well we score so we can improve upon our, is that available?
It is available. So this framework is available on our website, and it's a lot more comprehensive, honestly, than I was able to go into. And we have actually used this to look at foundational ID systems in other countries as well. And one more thing that we're also coming up with that is actually going to be released next week is a decision guide, which is sort of a toolkit for different stakeholders, which is sort of almost like a step-by-step series of choices that people can take while implementing a digital ID system. So that is available, yes.
Excellent. So the second question, in fact, would you see this framework becoming a digital public good in the sense that you would allow the community to work on it, improve it, and come up with the second version? The reason I'm saying this is because in about 10 years ago, when I was working with the World Bank in Africa at ID4D, we had put together a framework for evaluating the identity ecosystems of the countries. And I can tell you that version 1 of that framework and version whatever it is currently has evolved tremendously. And so it's important to allow different actors to come in and improve upon the framework. I'm fascinated by what you've done because we need that kind of objective way to evaluate. Is this a digital public good?
Absolutely. We hope for this to be adopted as widely as possible by everyone. We've tried to make it very as accessible and as simple as possible as well, not too technical. So we don't want it to be adopted only by policymakers. We want people, lawyers and civil society and anyone who wants to sort of analyze the system. We want it to be adopted as widely as possible. And also in terms of feedback, even the first iteration of this evaluation framework that we came up with maybe 2 years ago has undergone changes as well. As even after we worked with the 10 researchers, and we applied it in a very different context than we did in India, for example. We got a lot of feedback about, the questions, maybe things that we could add, things that maybe weren't as applicable. So any feedback is more than welcome. It's a constantly evolving document.
Excellent. In the interest of time, I just have one more question for you. Yeah. Because the formalism, really, I want to encourage everyone, all the government authorities, everyone who's listening to adopt this formalism, to try to do the assessment. But the question I have for you, now that you've done 10 country assessments, are you in dialogue with the identity authorities of those countries to inform them? Because you've done the assessment on their behalf. Could we help you as ID for Africa be in touch with the right people to present country by country in a private context to advise them about your findings?
That would be amazing, because I think some of the issues that we've had is getting in touch with identity authorities. I think some of our research were able to talk to certain regulators and people within the government, but I think to be able to have a direct conversation and sort of present our framework and how it can be used would be absolutely invaluable.
Wonderful. We've got work to do. Yesha, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much.
My team is listening, and we will be working with you to arrange for you access to the countries where you have done your reporting. And objective here is not to criticize, but to inform, so that we can have a positive step forward, we can improve. There is room to improve everywhere. So we are a community and we work together to do that. Okay, we've got a lot to do here, but I'll thank you again, and we'll come back to this topic later in the year. Now, I'm very pleased to have with us Dr. Yevgeniy Sirotin, who's going to share with us some really hot off the press research results that they've been doing on answering the question, which is, do we see a gender and racial bias in identity systems or biometric systems, specifically face and iris and fingerprints? And if this is the case, is there anything we can do about it to lessen that type of bias? Dr. Yevgeniy, thank you for being with us. Wonderful to have you. The forum is yours.
Well, thank you, Dr. Atick, for that introduction. And I'm going to share my screen. Thank you for the invitation to speak. I'm really looking forward to presenting these research results to the group. And today I'm going to be talking about race, gender, and identity in commercial face recognition. So before I get started, though, I need to just have this disclaimer. The views that I'm going to present today are my own personal views. They don't represent the views of my employer or the Department of Homeland Security, who is a sponsor of this work. So let me tell you a little bit about our group. Our group is the IDSL, and we are a biometrics testing lab that specializes in scenario tests of AI systems. We're scientists, we're engineers, we're biometric subject matter experts that are trusted by the government and industry stakeholders to perform unbiased assessments of these types of systems. And to date, we've evaluated hundreds of face, fingerprint, and iris identity systems for core performance metrics, but we've also started recently looking at how biometric performance metrics vary with respect to the demographics of the users of these systems, which is very important as these systems are deployed more broadly. We do maintain comprehensive holdings of responsibly acquired images. You may have heard that there's a lot of issues with some of the data sets that are used in biometrics that have been scraped off the internet without getting permission. We acquire images under IRB protection, and these images are suitable for evaluating biometric systems. And the goal of all this work is to identify how we can mitigate the risks that are associated with biometric technology deployments, which might be relevant for you. We look at things like system efficiency, effectiveness, satisfaction, how much people like using it, but also these questions about privacy and equitability. The scenario testing that we perform is going to be a little bit different than what you'd find in a typical computer lab. We actually test the full commercial systems simulated in operational use with diverse people that we bring in from the local area. And that allows us to make detailed observations about how these systems and how these diverse people interact with the technology. And we can leverage these observations and data for post hoc analyses. And I'm going to tell you about some of these that we've done today. Now, recently, and the topic of this livecast is the dark side of face recognition. And you may have read in the media that there's been a lot of reports talking about bias in this technology. For instance, the titles here, I'm showing some clippings from the news. Is face recognition too biased to be let loose? Face recognition systems are racist. And then this has culminated in recent calls for bans on face recognition technology. But we find that actually, there's been very limited assessment, at least publicly, of face recognition technologies that are available commercially. There's a lot of evidence that comes from more academic systems. And specifically what caught our attention is that, one of the things that is at issue is the fact that some of these technologies may categorize individuals into clusters based on ethnicity and gender, which, as stated here in this article that I'm presenting from earlier this year, could lead to discrimination. So we asked the question, does commercial face recognition cluster people by race and gender? And we happen to have some commercial face recognition systems on which we had data. But first, why do we worry about demographic effects in face recognition? Because if you look at the recent performance measures of modern face recognition systems, the error rates you see are often quite small. So in the order of, maybe 1 in 100,000 even. But the issue is that automated biometric systems, the way they're deployed, are often asked to scale because these systems are AI systems. You could throw lots of operations at them. And when you do that, when you increase the number of operations that these systems are performing, these error rates can compound so that even small error rates can grow large. So you can see it here in this chart. I'm showing you how an error rate of just 5 in 100,000 for a 1-to-1 biometric comparison can grow to a likelihood of 0.4, almost certain you're going to see it as more and more biometric operations are performed. So that's kind of the issue and why we worry about differentials, because now differentials between very small numbers can grow into differentials between big numbers. So because we work directly with people using this commercial biometric technology in our evaluations, we were able to see during one of our tests and compare how these technologies performed for our diverse population of test participants. And what I'm showing you is something that we noticed. We noticed some systematic differences between errors made by different identity technologies. So on the left, what I'm showing you are false matches made by an iris recognition system. And you could see here that these pairs of faces that are individuals that were falsely matched by iris are random with respect to race and gender. However, what I'm showing you on the right is a similar result, but for face recognition. You could see something that's starkly different here. Instead of a random assortment based on race and gender, you actually see that all the false matches, 80% of these false matches, were between people of the same race and gender. And you may find this result for face recognition intuitive. But in this talk, I'm going to ask you to challenge that intuition. And my background is actually from neuroscience, so I'm always excited to show a picture of the brain. But in fact, what I want to make point here is that your intuition for the face recognition performance may be due to an unconscious bias. Our brain uniquely has brain areas that are dedicated to processing faces quickly, because that's how we identify other people. And what I'm showing you here in this spinning picture of a brain is that little red spot is the fusiform face area, which is the area of your brain dedicated to face processing. We don't have similar areas for processing fingerprints or iris texture patterns or other biometrics. And what I want you to understand is to evaluate face recognition objectively, we need to overcome these intuitions and unconscious biases. And we tried to do that by comparing face recognition performance to iris recognition on an equal footing. So in order to move forward on answering this question, does commercial face recognition cluster people by race and gender, we need to overcome some challenges. And some of the challenges to evaluating commercial systems for these demographic effects is that there are no international standards right now for how to measure demographic performance differences in biometric technologies. So how do you begin? Well, one of the things that our group is actually working on now is an ISO standard development for testing biometric systems for demographic differentials, but these are not in place yet. At the same time, we see many methods in the literature, in the academic literature, then these focus a lot of times on having access to algorithm architectures and inner workings of the algorithm that we really don't have access to in commercial biometric systems. So if we want to take a commercial biometric system and purchase it, the company is not going to give us access to their proprietary AI. So we needed to develop a new approach that can be applied to black box algorithms that you don't know how they work. They can be applied across the different demographic groups that doesn't require excessive sample sizes with maybe hundreds of samples instead of thousands or millions of samples, how a lot of these AI systems are typically evaluated, and works even in the absence of biometric errors, because with smaller sample sizes and low error rates, you might not see any errors. So how did we do that? Well, we started by visualizing the issue a little bit more quantitatively. So I showed you the slide before with these false matches, but this is a more quantitative representation of the same idea. And here I'm showing you face recognition similarity scores between pairs of faces. Red scores actually indicate higher similarity. And in the lower left square, I'm highlighting scores that represent similarities between two different individuals that I both identified as Black females. And in the upper right are scores between multiple individuals that are different that identified as white females. Now in the lower right, what I'm showing you for this one face recognition algorithm are scores that are produced when white individuals, white females, are compared to Black females. And you could see here fairly easily, you could see that scores between people of different demographic groups are lower, less red in this square. And we found this same pattern across our full sample of 5 commercial face recognition algorithms that we saw. So you could see face 1, face 2, face 3, face 4, face 5 in general have this pattern. But when we compared it to our iris algorithm, we saw something very different. Iris was completely random with respect to these groups. And so, so there's something going on here. Now, how do we quantify that? And we developed mathematical methods, and I have these here, but I won't go through them, to measure exactly how much of the score variation in face recognition scores can be attributed to these demographic groupings between people, race, and gender. And here I'm showing you the results on the left of this clustering behavior across our sample of algorithms. And you could see the 5 face recognition algorithms and then the iris algorithm at the end. And you could basically see from this is that the level of clustering is something that we've developed, this clustering index. It hovers at around 10%. And so that allows us to put a number on the amount of performance variation in face recognition that's actually associated with these demographic characteristics. Now, you might see that and say, okay, face recognition algorithms cluster people by race and gender. But I would say that 10% is a minority of the net variation in these scores can be attributed to this. And of course, for the iris algorithm, the clustering was quite low. So next slide. Why do we worry about this clustering? And so what we also did in our recent paper is to really frame the problem of what is the operational risk of race and gender clustering. And so I'm going back to a chart that I showed you a little while ago, and I'm adding in this to this issue of scaling of errors. I'm adding in this potential for differences between scores for based on demographic characteristics. And here I'm showing you, let's say we had a system where scores between people of the same demographics, like white female to white female, were a little bit lower, a little bit higher than scores between unrelated people that are between different demographic groups, here in cyan for different groups, and here in red for same groups. And what you could see that is, if you have a situation where you have a gallery that has a particular demographic composition, say all white females, if you take another white female and you try to match it against that gallery, that individual is going to experience a higher false positive error rate than an individual that was not a white female, just simply because of their demographic group membership. And so this creates a greater error hazard based only on shared demographics. Now, for something like boarding an airplane where you want to get on the plane, and if you false match or false identify to a list of people that are on this plane, it's really not much of an inconvenience to you. But in the case of a deny list, it might be. You don't want to falsely match to a deny list simply because you share some demographic group membership with other people on that list. And so that's the hazard that's presented by this gender and race clustering in face recognition. So can face recognition work without relying on race and gender? And we extended our work a little bit. Now, of course, we don't have access to the underlying workings of these face systems, but we extended our work a little bit to try to address this question. We noticed that, as I told you before, these distributions of scores moved around based on race and gender similarities. So scores for people of the same race and gender, that I'm showing you down at the bottom here in green, were a little bit higher than scores between people of different race and gender. We did a mathematical operation that removed these this 10% variation based on race and gender. We removed that variation from the scores. And now we found that we could create this reconstructed, best case scenario score space that now didn't have these variations for a face recognition algorithm. And what we found is that after that transformation, those scores still were able to distinguish between, comparisons between people that are of the two different faces of the same person, that's the blue scores here, and faces of different people. So based on this mathematically removing similarity score variation related to race and gender, we found that we could remove race and gender clustering from face recognition while keeping distinctions between individuals. And so we concluded based on that is that face recognition could still be useful even without using race and gender features, using other features of the face that aren't related to these demographic characteristics. So what are the takeaways that I want to leave you with? At IDSL, we have developed some tools to evaluate race and gender clustering in commercial face recognition. We found that all tested face recognition algorithms clustered people by race and gender. And as I mentioned, this is intuitive, but it creates a hazard of false positive errors based only on demographics, which is undesirable. We found that race and gender clustering, however, accounts for a minority, 10% of total non-mated score variation in face recognition. I suggested that face recognition would likely still be useful without using these features. Now, one note that I want to mention is that, protected demographic groups may vary by locale. It may not always be race and gender. There may be other groups in your locales that are important to have equal performance for. And it may not be practical to always train new face recognition algorithms for each locale. So companies may want to create, sort of adapters to remove locale-specific protected demographic features. And you may need to confirm this, the success of that, by performing independent testing to help determine if face recognition is suitable for your operations. So that's all I've got today, Dr. Atick.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sirotin. Actually, operator, end the sharing of the slide. Oh, yes. Thank you. In fact, this would be a good point for us to take community voices. If anybody wants to join me and Dr. Sirotin to give perspective on the issue of bias and biometrics or evidence for it in testing, please join me. In the meantime, let me ask you, have we been driving to the right finish line correctly in terms of the improving the accuracy of these algorithms? As you know, we've been pushing for the last 30 years, I remember from the days when I was an academic, I was a neuroscientist like yourself, working on improving the algorithms, the driving force was always improve that last mile, that last fraction of a percentage point in accuracy, which has resulted today in phenomenal improvements, orders of magnitude. Is it time for us to actually say in the real world, it's not the absolute accuracy that matters, but it has to be some sort of weighted accuracy, which is gender blind, race blind, or protected group blind? Can we start talking about new accuracy metrics that we could challenge the commercial sector to optimize for?
Yeah, so I think, Dr. Atick, you're right. Over the last 10 years, especially, as face recognition has moved into using convolutional neural nets to really boost the performance of these systems, we now see error rates that are getting to be quite low. And I think because of this success, we now start looking at the technology in a new light. We want to apply it to more use cases. We want to scale these operations. And now we worry about smaller and smaller errors and whether or not these systems are fair. So I think right now we need to take a step back and take a look at some sort of trade-off space between accuracy and these questions of fairness, and try to understand, where do current commercial systems fall, and can we even select commercial systems that maybe don't have these trade-offs or may produce accuracy that is acceptable within our requirements, however, also have this added benefit of being more fair. So I think it is time to take a step back and reassess how well this AI technology performs for different groups.
Exactly. That's a wonderful message. Now, what about if I am an identity authority or an organization that is serving a somewhat large and diverse constituency? What type of things would you advise them to do as they adopt facial recognition for their scenarios and applications? What should they do if they want to not find themselves in a controversy or find themselves producing harm from their implementation? What should they do?
Well, I think, it's very hard to tell how the system performs in these operational scenarios without testing. And that's something that, working with the Department of Homeland Security, we've been doing a lot of work, and they've been extremely, I would say they would have been taking the lead on ensuring that these systems are appropriately tested before deployment, and investing in testing and evaluation from independent groups can really do a lot to sort of substantiate any claims that manufacturers of these systems may make. And of course, there's no manufacturer that's going to advertise that their system doesn't perform well for different demographic groups. And in many cases, they simply do not know, because this kind of testing is difficult. There are no international standards yet, and it really requires some infrastructure to put together. So I think either developing your own test infrastructure or outsourcing to an independent third party is the way to go.
Now, one of the questions that's coming in, and there are several for you, if we are unable to cover them all, I ask you to please answer them offline. On the face recognition biometric, how do the commercial vendors react to your findings? Have there been enough time for them to digest these findings? I mean, I looked at the papers, they're irreproachable, they're very scientific, and they demonstrate a clear process. What's the reaction from the vendor community of face recognition?
So we have only started to introduce these approaches for evaluating these systems recently. So there hasn't been a lot of time yet for the companies to go in and react. I think overall there's been a lot of work going on with the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, that has been putting out some reports on algorithm performance. But I wanted to critically say that face recognition technology performance is not just about matching algorithms. And that's important because when you put together your system in a scenario, in your operational use case, you're going to have more than just the algorithm as a component. You're going to have a camera and that system interaction. So I think overall the vendors are, they want technologies that perform well. They want technologies that perform across groups. And I think what they're looking for also is that support to provide them the information they need so that their engineers can make sure that these systems work well. Like, for example, selecting a camera that images all shades of a person's skin tone. And that's other work that my group has pursued and has tried to communicate out to the industry.
Okay, excellent. Dr. Sirotin, there are questions on the, I just want to see. Oh, one more question. Has there been any attempts to extend this research to other biometric modalities?
Well, so we made an initial attempt to compare face recognition to iris as a sort of a control, because it gives us a sanity check for our own perceptual biases. However, there's been other work in academia and past work in government, I would say, that has looked at other biometric modalities, most notably iris and fingerprints. But I'm not aware of any study that has recently compared those three modalities to each other in the same level playing field. And I think standards will help get us there.
Excellent. I see we do have community voices. We have two individuals. Sean, could you please introduce who you are, who you're with, where you're coming from, and state your point?
Hi, I'm Sean Maton from South Africa. I work in the financial services ecosystem. My question relates to, is there a problem or a difference between facial matching versus facial recognition? So would you see this bias also coming out with facial matching? In other words, on a one-to-one type scenario, I have an image, I need to match it to a golden source. Would you see that coming out in that scenario? Or is it purely in this, I've got an image, I need to go and find it on a database of another 5 million?
Right. Thank you for that question. So in more standard terminology, we talk about identification. That's the 1 to N problem, where you're matching a face to a lot of faces, and verification, where we talk about just matching a face to one other face. And I would say this, so the issues in one-to-one verification today with modern face recognition technology, there are going to be very low false positive error rates. I think there you worry more about the false negative error rates, where a person that is of the same identity doesn't match their high quality reference images because, the camera didn't take a good picture, or they changed their hairstyle, or things like that. So I think you have one set of problems for verification. And then for identification, again, with small galleries, these error rates are so low that you're unlikely to experience very large variation. But as these galleries increase in size, sometimes these galleries can reach, hundreds of thousands of people. And in that case, these error rates that are small for one-to-one variation can compound. And that's what my charts tried to show.
Yeah. Okay, Sean, thank you for that question. We move on. Wuri, could you please state your purpose, state who you are, where you're from? I think we've seen you on video today on the documentary, so people are familiar with you, but please go ahead. Please unmute yourself.
Okay. Thank you. I'm Wuri Mamadou Timbabari, the Chief Country Coordinator for Network 8. Thanks very much to Doctor for the presentation. And I'm a little bit concerned when it comes to facial identity and iris algorithm, because most times it has to be more scientific, and rather than trying very hard to localize it. And we understood that most times facial and iris recognition most times used for security purposes, and able to identify people that engage in any form of security issues. But iris and facial recognition, and also most times used in academics, people in colleges and all of those stuff. But I want to take it from that circle to the community level, where you talk about gender and discrimination with regards to those, and with regards to those community. So I want to ask doctor, what the best way for persons with disability, and especially maybe engage who once have maybe a high risk recognition and then fall into an accident and become disfigured, or maybe involved in whatever accident it is, and what the mechanism for those kind of people.
Okay, thank you, Wuri. I don't know, Dr. Sirotin, if you want to take that.
So I would say that no matter which biometric modality that you ultimately choose, if you choose biometrics, I think if that biometric by definition has to take a measurement of the person's physiological characteristics, like the shape of their face or the texture of their irises. And if that becomes damaged or disfigured, then there's almost certainly going to be an effect in how that technology works for them. And so the only thing that I would say to, offering people a choice is often good. So when you're coming into through immigration, there's sometimes multiple redundant systems like face and fingerprints that are available to authenticate you in case one of those systems is not going to be working for you. So I think offering people a choice of biometric modalities may be helpful.
Okay, thank you for that. One last community voice from Mudasiru Dahiro. Please state where you're from and what your point is.
Hello. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
My name is Mudasiru Dahiro. I'm still Mudasiru Dahiro from Sokoto State of Nigeria, working with a government agency. I had a nice presentations from the doctor, but I have two questions for him. One question is how the system is working. It's like they say they're testing the working, and the integrity, the accuracy. And if you look at the presentation, the previous presentation we have in Ghana, they started their own from 15th and above, and they do cluster. So what is the yardstick? What are the number they started in doing that?
So I think I heard the question of, what is the, how accurate are these systems? We see this clustering, but how big an issue is it? Yeah. And I think the answer is that today's face recognition technologies are extremely accurate, and they actually, in many scenarios, in many use cases, they can work very well across demographic groups. For cases where you have limited galleries and you're not scaling that operation too much, I think the technologies are going to work with very, very low error rates overall for every group. However, I think the point that I wanted to drive home is that as you scale out these operations, if you do something like trying to perform face recognition on a live video feed, or if you're performing recognition against very large galleries, these differences become an issue. And if you're in a denialist type scenario, that could be something that you may want to look at. So I think overall performance is very, very good. However, if you're operationalizing a system that has these characteristics of large scale, I think there you need to take a look at these disparities.
I think an important point to raise is that when you deny somebody, even one person denial unfairly, is still a problem. To me, it's not a statistical issue. At the end of the day, if it comes down to unfair treatment, even of one individual at the end, that is still a problem. And that's why we would have to work to ensure that nobody, like we say, nobody's left behind, nobody's denied. And so I think it's great to understand, but even if the numbers could be small, I think within the context of a development and social rights, even one person being denied their social rights would be a problem.
I agree completely, and these systems should not be deployed, of course, on their own. There should always be a method for redress and other processes so that everybody could get the services that they need. Exactly.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yevgeniy Sirotin. It was wonderful to see you. And please, I'd like to encourage you to answer some of the questions that have come online as you get off the screen. Operator, now we would like to move on to the panel discussion. In this segment, I want to talk to experts about their perspectives, about the systems, what systems could be built and how they should be built in order to empower social and human rights. We want to understand the shortcomings of the existing systems. We want to understand also the evidence for the exclusion. And so with us in this panel, we've got Christian Van Veen from New York Law, Caitlin Siofi from New York Law as well, and Dorothy Mukasa from Unwanted Witness. I'd like to start by asking you, Christian, to kick us off, but perhaps each one of you could introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about you and about your organization and what you work on. Then we can come back and get your perspective, Christian, at an overall high level.
Thanks so much, Joseph, for that introduction and for the invitation to this important event today. So my name is Christian Van Veen. I'm the director of the Digital Welfare State and Human Rights Project at NYU Law in New York City. And I'm also an adjunct professor of law at the law school. Our work started in the context of the UN mandate of the Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights a number of years ago, when we started to look on that mandate at issues of government digitalization and their implications on the human rights of especially poor and marginalized groups. Our project then spun off from that work and has focused on issues of government transformation, digital transformation, and human rights. We do research, we organize webinars like yourself, and we are involved in policy discussions around the use of new technologies in government and their implications for human rights.
Caitlin?
Thanks very much, Joseph. So my name is Caitlin Chaffee, and I'm a research scholar at the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice at NYU Law School, working with Christian on the Digital Welfare State and Human Rights Project. And I'm a human rights lawyer by training and work across our research and advocacy, and have been particularly focused on the digitalization of the state, particularly the digitalization of social protection systems, social welfare systems, and most recently through our Everyone Counts initiative on the development of foundational and national digital ID systems as a means of delivering public and private services.
Excellent. Dorothy?
Thank you so much. I'm Dorothy Mukasa, and I'm the team lead at Unwanted Witness. Unwanted Witness works at the intersection of technology and human rights. For several years, we've been working on advocating for the right to privacy, and therefore we've been instrumental in ensuring that the Uganda gets a data protection law, which was passed in 2019. And throughout the work on privacy and data protection is where we interfaced with a digital ID system. But over the time, we've realized that it's not all about privacy and data protection. The ID system scales out to other social and economic rights that lead to exclusion and also affects a lot of other lives and human rights. Happy to be here. Thank you.
Excellent. Christian, start us off with your perspective with the promise of digital ID systems and their pitfalls as you see them when it comes to social, human, and economic rights. I mean, we hear these terms interchangeably. Perhaps you could help us sort of deconflict those terminologies. If there is a legal definition, then we should be paying attention to guide us through it.
Thanks so much, Joseph. And I'll start us off talking about the narratives in terms of promises around social inclusion, and then contrast that with some of the risks we see. But I understand that my colleague Caitlin and also my other colleague Dorothy in Uganda will take us into more depth on these issues. So I'll take a global view. So I think as a starting point, the global discourse around government digital ID systems in the years since SDG 16.9 was passed in 2015 has focused on all of the promises attached to these systems. And what I think is happening now in recent years is that we see the emergence of a counter movement of human rights and other organizations that are pointing out the severe risks that have already materialized in this context. And one of those risks is multifaceted exclusion, which makes the topic of our panel today, I think, highly relevant. So I work on human rights, and that includes work on social rights. Those are rights like the right to social security, to health, to education. And I think the basic promise here behind digital ID systems is that they are tools of social inclusion. In other words, that they give individuals better access to those specific social rights that I just mentioned, but also to other human rights, including the right to vote, for instance. But I think what's very important to do here is to deconstruct those promises made in the context of the global debate on digital ID in order to assess if we are really on the same page here, people working on social rights and people promoting digital ID systems. So what is that promise of social inclusion? I like the following quote by the former CEO of the World Bank, Ms. Georgieva, from 2017, which I think sort of captures that promise very well. She says that digital ID systems have transformational potential for the benefit of people who are currently not being served because they cannot be seen or heard. So that's the starting point, according to the proponents. And there's also a statistic by the World Bank that is then often mentioned, namely that there are 1.1 billion invisible people without ID around the world, majority of whom live in Africa. Now, the framing of that problem then by proponents is that the lack of ID bars them from access to their social rights, in addition to civil rights and participating in the private economy. And the purported cause of that problem is that the existing systems in low and middle income countries of civil registration, especially, are either non-existing or faulty. They're paper-based, they're full of errors, there's room for fraud, there's a lot of exclusion there. And the solution to this problem is to build digital ID systems, which are inclusive and trusted, because the idea is that they will empower people to access, for instance, those social rights that I just mentioned. Now, let me say at the outset that I agree with lack of ID being a huge problem. I also agree that it's a worthy goal to see if everyone can access their social rights, to which they are entitled by the mere virtue of being human. But I think there are several flaws in the argumentation on the promotional side, so to speak. So let me mention briefly 3 of those problems that I see. So first, the 1.1 billion individuals we are talking about, I don't think they are invisible. They exist, they are visible, and they can be seen or heard. The problem really is that they are neglected and that they are ignored. And that is a subtle, but I think very important difference here. So if an individual does not have an ID and does not subsequently have access to their social rights, I think the root cause of that problem is often political. It's a political decision. It's not a technical glitch. So then the question we should ask ourselves, I think, is why would a state, why would a government that already deliberately or negligently excludes part of its population suddenly stop excluding when they switch from a CRVS system to a digital ID system? Lack of identity and lack of a proper functioning CRVS system is not necessarily a principal cause, in my view, of the problem of exclusion. In many cases, it's merely a symptom of much deeper underlying and very pernicious political problems. A second problem that I see with the argumentation here is that I think we need to be a little bit more honest about the arguments in favor of digital ID system. Of course, inclusion is mentioned, but is that really the driving force in our move towards digital ID? If you look at the World Bank's publications, it's a leading voice in this. For instance, its practitioner's guide, they mention a lot of other reasons why countries should adopt digital ID systems. They mention making sure that government-to-person transfers are without fraud and without error. They talk about helping private corporations, reducing their identity verification cost requirements. They talk about the generation of new markets, about the core foundation that digital ID will be for digital economies, and they talk about stimulating cross-border trade. And that list is not full, I think. There are many other reasons why there's this move towards digital ID systems. There's a lot of money to be made on the part of vendors, which is an obvious reason why many actors are enthusiastic. There are security-related reasons to integrate digital ID systems, especially in fragile states. And there's, of course, the desire of Western states to curb migration flows, and identifying especially African individuals is an important factor in that for Western governments. So we can agree or disagree on whether these are worthy goals, the ones that I just mentioned. I don't want to take a position on that right now, but I think we should be honest. Social inclusion is often not really the main reason why these systems are being integrated. And then we should hardly be surprised that exclusion is an outcome if inclusion is not really the real primary goal. Now, third and final criticism on the narrative around digital ID is that the introduction of new digital ID systems can do more than merely replicate existing problems of exclusion and related harm, but they create their own new and unique exclusionary issues. And one major problem that was already mentioned earlier is that often these digital ID systems become de facto or legal requirements to accessing a whole plethora of social and other human rights, as well as access to private economies. And so this creates a centralized bottleneck for accessing rights, for accessing services. And that centralized bottleneck doesn't have workarounds that used to exist when systems were more fragmented. And that means that a lot of groups who aren't specifically targeted for exclusion traditionally can now also become the victims of exclusion, the elderly, women, and many other groups. And the reasons for that are manifold. So let me wrap up. I have been speaking, of course, about these issues at a great level of generality, but my colleague Dorothy Costa will talk about a report that she and us and ICER did on the Uganda digital ID system. In that report, we wrote that it was no secret that Ndagamuntu in Uganda is primarily a national security project. We detailed the severe exclusion that was the result there. Final thing to say, Joseph, before the publication of that report, we should say we made a good faith effort to engage with NIRA, an issue that came up in one of your questions. In NIRA in Uganda, we reached out to them before the publication of the report, but never heard back from them, unfortunately. I just wanted to say that we still very much would welcome a detailed written response from NIRA, and I'm very glad that the new ED of NIRA in Uganda, Rosemary Kisembo, is in the audience today. That's great that she's engaging on these issues.
Yeah, Christian, thank you for this. I think I respect the narrative that you're presenting, but at the same time, I've got a couple of problems with the factual basis of some of it. In fact, what it doesn't recognize, it doesn't recognize the fact that as we evolve, as the world evolves and there's technology in the world, game changers can be available that can solve problems that have so far been difficult to solve. For example, while we believe it will be utopian to have everybody registered at birth in the CRVS system and going forward, we still have a reality on the ground where basically large numbers of people have never been registered in a civil registration system where they could rely on as a basis for demanding inclusion and access and services. And so in that case, I would not say that the new interest that we're seeing in government around the world of creating inclusive systems today is being motivated by something else, or else you would have seen it in the CRVS. CRVS has been a very, very difficult problem. And what we're saying is that in digital identity, just like what we are witnessing in the COVID world, Zoom has made a new reality possible. And I think digital identity could address and solve problems that were not solvable easily through the old context. That doesn't mean that it doesn't produce new problems. And that's why we're talking. We're talking about, are there frameworks where the new problems could be solved, could be eliminated, so that these are realistic and accessible to everybody. And perhaps you can answer your perspective on that, because if I walked away from your speech, I walked away thinking that you do not believe digital identity systems have any value in governance or inclusion.
Thanks for that pushback, Joseph. That's super helpful. So let me say, first of all, that I'm not defending here per se one previous iteration of systems that were rolled out to register individuals. We all know that the birth rate registration, for instance, at present in a lot of sub-Saharan African countries is incredibly low, and that's a huge problem. And so to just hang on to systems like that is not necessarily the solution. I agree with that premise, but you should wonder, why is it that in many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, so few individuals have been registered? Is that really only related to the technical affordances of CRVS systems, or is that related to problems of lack of institutional capacity,
Yes.
political motivations, etc.?
And
So
also infrastructure. You look at priority. You want to feed the population, you want to create jobs, or you want to create centers for enrollment. Right now, average number of kilometers that somebody needs to go to in some African country could be anywhere between 15 to 40 kilometers to go and register. If you want to build budgets and insert registrars, we have to change the model. We have to create at a distance. We have to create mobile platforms that allow somebody in a remote village to be able to tell the government, hey, I exist. I don't need to walk 40 kilometers in order for me to present myself. I think the reality is we are entering into an era where we do have the possibility to make a difference and a change. And the failure of the past can be explained not as conspiracy theory or through ill motivation of the government. I happen to be an optimist and happen to be perhaps naive in believing in goodwill. And I think the goodwill is, can we now use what we've got as an enabler to deliver what we haven't been able to deliver in the past? So
I think both Caitlin and Dorothy will have something to say specifically about sort of distance to registration offices in the context of digital ID systems in Uganda, which is also not ideal. So I think we should sort of look at the counterfactual there to see if this is really bringing improvements. But I agree with the sentiment that we should look at any means available, including digital technologies, to include individuals. And if that really happens, I would be super helpful. But perhaps we have a different take on the political realities around it. And I admire your optimism. I guess I come out on the more skeptical side of things, looking at the recent track record of rollout.
Caitlin, join us in this discussion. Let's understand your perspective on this.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Christian in that I think that, you know, we're all open to the idea that a new system or a change system can improve social inclusion. You know, we are advocates for economic and social rights, and we want governments to take action to fulfill those rights. So I think that the general premise is an area where we all agree. But I think one of the reasons that we're here today is because there's a growing body of evidence now from digital ID systems, from new digital ID systems, that's simply become too large and varied to ignore now. We've seen exclusion related to Aadhaar in India, where there have been issues in food delivery systems, in elections, in other social services. And now as these systems develop, we've seen similar issues emerging in different places in Africa, in Uganda, in Kenya, in Nigeria, and the many different ways that even these new systems, whether or not they're intentioned well or not, are generating exclusion. And I think Christian's point about the framing and the emphasis on sort of being too optimistic has really blinded us to some of these really critical human rights concerns and prevented us from learning from these new experiences, from these initial experiences, about what steps we realistically need to take if they're going to actually deliver their promises. So we've heard a lot of different case studies today, and we can talk about more that are kind of more specific. But I think one of the biggest takeaways is that the people being excluded, older persons, women, persons with disabilities, are the very groups that these systems are intended to serve. These are the people who have been seen as to be invisible. So it really generates a sort of existential crisis about the system itself, that is this actually living up to its initial promise of inclusion? And also these are groups that are specially protected under international and national human rights law. So we are duty bound to pay special attention to how a system will impact them specifically.
Right. But Caitlin, what I find actually, it's quite easy to have negative, sensational news talking about, well, look at this individual that's been excluded. Obviously, this is very important, but we don't hear about the 95% of the people who have been included, whose lives have been simplified, whose ability to exercise and participate in their society have been improved. In a way, there is an inherent bias, and it's a mediatic bias. It's the bias of the media, which basically likes to report negative news. The headlines that says, you know, life is wonderful, that's kind of a boring news. But to say that, oh, there's some evil conspiracy going on because a certain number of people have been excluded, that is more sensational and that attracts attention. From my perspective, we will not rest until everybody, 100%, even one person, like I said to Dr. Sirotin, an exclusion of one person is an exclusion of a fundamental access to somebody who's entitled to their human rights and their social rights. But I call upon all of the human rights organizations to really examine not the glass sort of half empty. Look at what has been achieved. Is there an improvement? Let's do an assessment to see the number of people that have been included and what remains to be done in terms of the goal. At the same time, keep in mind the realism that we are living in a world where budgets are scarce. We're living in a world where governments are not funding their projects at the level that they need to be funding. So authorities are struggling with this. And so in a way, I need civil society and your thoughtfulness to help us establish benchmarks to say how far are we from total inclusion, because we all agree that this is the goal that we need to be aiming at. But the fact that we still have 20%, 30% exclusion happening is no reason to say, let us stop trying. You see, maybe I'm misquoting you, but please give me a constructive direction.
I don't think at all that it's sensationalist to focus on those who are excluded. And I think that the issue isn't necessarily that we are not focusing enough on the good news. I think the promise of these systems, as Christian has outlined, is that this was going to particularly help marginalized and vulnerable groups, that this is going to help render the invisible visible, that this was going to ensure that no one is left behind. So if that is actually the intention of the system, and I don't engage in conspiracy theories, I think, you know, if that is the intention of the system, then it's incumbent upon us to look at those systems and to evaluate them from that perspective. And let's be very specific when we talk about exclusion here, because exclusion can take many different forms. And if we're gonna, you've asked for a kind of a legal gloss on this, but what we're essentially talking about here is discrimination, right? We're talking about substantive and formal discrimination, so discrimination in law and in fact. And we are talking about indirect and direct discrimination, so intentional and unintentional discrimination. So these are duties and obligations of the government to take acts and to prevent omissions that are going to ensure that people have access to their economic and social rights. So I think if we're looking for a constructive critique, we need to ask ourselves whether or not we're achieving these goals. And if we are not, then it's incumbent on us also to evaluate the system more holistically, because I think, you know, one of the main areas of discussion about digital ID systems has been focused on so-called guardrails, right? On regulatory, policy, legislative frameworks that we can put in place that are going to guide us towards a more inclusive future. But fundamentally, if the political will isn't there to achieve this inclusive future, none of these guardrails are ever going to succeed. So we need to be thinking much more holistically about what the inclusive future looks like and how digital ID systems play a role in what is a much broader economic, social, and political context. So I think we need to be attentive to the fact that in every area of economic and social life where a digital ID system might be delivering benefits to some, it might also be delivering harms. So I don't think that that's sensationalist. I think that's a question of good governance. And just I think a final point here is, you know, as you say, many governments are resource constrained, and it's very difficult to finance these systems. And fundamentally, the question becomes a value for money question as well, in that the costs of administering these systems, if they're not delivering on that inclusive promise, then we need to be evaluating whether or not they are delivering value for money from that perspective.
I'm not against that at all, but I also would argue that we have to look, like you said, a holistic evaluation, look at how much they are delivering and how much they still need to deliver, and look for corrective course actions so that we can improve and deliver on the total potential. No one expects these systems to be able to perform from day one. I mean, we've seen even Microsoft Windows. It took 20 years to debug all aspects of them, that they become part of our lives, that you cannot live without. And so the point is well taken. I mean, this panel, by the way, is not a balanced panel. It's on one side, so I want to point that out. So I'm taking a pushback. It's not the role I should be taking, but I'm taking a pushback because I don't want this panel to take one tilt. Because we did not construct this panel in a manner. We constructed it in a way so we hear you and then take note of the concerns and issues that you are raising. So let me go to Dorothy and understand how civil society on the ground can help governments know where the weaknesses are and can help them plug gaps in where they are present. Dorothy?
Yes, thank you so much. I want to, first of all, say that civil society is not at all against digital ID systems. It's really for supports the initiative. Like in Uganda, NIRA has really tried to conduct drives in different countries to make sure that they reach. But I mean, the numbers that are excluded are really so many, that they can't really cover all the people like they would have wished. So what civil society then does is to take independent assessment of the system, independent assessment in terms of conducting research of how the system was delivered and what are the gaps, and then provide recommendations of what needs really to be done. For instance, in the Ugandan case, several studies have been done with the recent that was done by Unwanted Witness, the welfare state of the New York University, and then ISA, to simply look at key groups that have been excluded for over years and how they're also being excluded. The exclusion is being exacerbated by the introduction of the ID systems. And these are basically women who are seeking healthcare, because we know the maternal mortality rate is really high, but also the vulnerabilities that women have over the time suffered, but also the older persons who are really beneficiaries of the social assistance grant for the elder persons, a program that's being implemented by government. From statistics that are really provided by government itself, we are able to discover that between 23% to 33% adults in Uganda do not have access to a national ID card. And therefore, what this then means is that these people are really excluded from accessing public services and private services. And the root cause to this is I should say, I'll divide it into three parts. One is the legal requirement, the other is the technical issue, and the thirdly is administrative challenges. So the legal requirement, for instance, I guess policymakers, when they were really framing the law, they did take into consideration that at one point, 33% Ugandans would be missing out on national ID cards. And therefore, the law requires that all Ugandans, it's mandatory for all Ugandans to really provide ID cards for them to access different social and social services, in this country. But this also speaks to fundamental basic rights. For example, healthcare, education, access to employment, access to a SIM card, financial services. Everybody has to present a national ID in order to really access. So 33% of Ugandans do not have a life at all, relating to the video that my Kenyan colleague said, life begins when you get a national ID today, without a national ID, there's no life at all. So 33 do not have lives at all. They are not recognized by the system. And therefore, the law requires that they present a national ID. But there's also a cost implication that the law places in terms of replacement of a national ID. Not many Ugandans have the money to really, pay the cost in order to replace a national ID. Several of them have lost these IDs, and therefore they've stayed without IDs for years. This leaves them, really stranded on the side of exclusion. On the technical side, even when the law provides for biometrics, it becomes a technical challenge that not everybody is able to be captured in the system. For example, older women who have taken years of intensive labor have lost out on their fingerprints. They can't be read by the biometric machine. This speaks to exclusion. The failures in the technical systems, the errors when it comes to registration of individuals. For example, in our research, we discovered that for a woman who is over 80 years is recorded as below 80, and therefore they are not able to benefit from a life-saving relief that government provides. And this is not their own making, but it's a technical challenge, the issues of
or an administrative challenge. Governments make errors. Even in the developed countries, they make errors. And the question is there a recourse mechanism to make sure that these people who have been harmed by an error are able to correct that error? I think
that's where I was heading to, the lack of redress mechanism.
Right.
What happens to people who are carrying IDs, whose data is really poorly captured by the system? What are the redress mechanisms? They're really not flexible, and therefore people miss out in these spaces. So, but also when it comes to accountability, like Christian mentioned, the system was built on a national security concern. It's on grounds of national security. So it becomes very hard to seek for accountability when it comes to how the system operates, but also the interaction between the public and the system itself, because there is that barrier and fear of a national security. You do not want to tamper with national security issues because citizens are not experts. So this leaves them out. And I'll tell you, civil society plays a key role when it comes to bridging this gap. For example, we've done this report with a joint report, and we've engaged, for example, members of parliament, leaders in parliament on this matter, and many of them identify with these challenges. Some of them are really legal challenges that really require amendment of the law, which does not, the law that which amendments do not really are not really fast and do not really catch up with the technology and the challenges that people face. But these such engagements and reports really contribute to highlighting the concerns within, and would only pray that assessment at a national level is undertaken by different actors. I'm happy that the ED is on this platform to listen, to hear out, civil society as we speak about these issues. We are not fighting the system, but we want everybody to be included in the system, make sure that all people are served equally.
Yes, Dorothy, that's a good point to stop at. We ran out of time, but I am counting on civil society and the government to work together. And we want to promote that dialogue. We could go on and on in this discussion, but I want to move on to the program. I want to bring in actually the ED, the executive director. So I thank you all for joining us. Time flew very, very quickly, but we will expect to hear from you again and to bring you on in a very constructive dialogue keep identifying where the challenges are, keep identifying who's been excluded, and let's try working together in good faith to eliminate that exclusion. With that, I'd like to welcome my next guest, who is the new executive director, Rosemary Kisembo from NIRA, Uganda. Please unmute your phone, your computer, and I'd like to start by asking you to say just a little bit about yourself. Let us know when did you join NIRA, what was your background, etc. Welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Atick. My name is Rosemary Kisembo. I joined NIRA exactly 6 months ago.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to take this opportunity to also recognize one of my predecessors who's online, Judy. And I would like to thank that. My background is in IT in the government, in the public space, service delivery, leveraging technology for service delivery. I have worked specifically with the road infrastructure sector and the tax revenue mobilization sector. So I'm no stranger therefore to service delivery and the challenges that come with it, as well as the gains. So I'm grateful for this opportunity, and I will definitely reach out to Dorothy in regard to the research and the observations that they have made. As you have pointed out, even if we have just one unregistered Ugandan, that is exclusion. And therefore, until we have every Ugandan registered, we shall have work to do and have to reach out to them. We at NIRA are privileged to serve 41.6 million Ugandans and aliens. And the uniqueness of identity is such that identity is one big word, but every individual is unique. That, together with a cultural context, makes identity a not very easy subject to generalize or to talk about. So therefore, this has been, digital identity and identity via systems has been made complex by things like further complex by the COVID-19 pandemic and the other infrastructure challenges, where you have a population of 33% unidentified, but there is a lockdown or a partial lockdown. They are hard to reach areas. They are islands, they are mountains. However, that is no excuse to providing a service. And we will take on the challenge to provide the service, even in the face of the legal and technical challenges, because really no problem is insurmountable. And identity can further be improved by understanding our cultural context, by pushing for more dialogue. I will take the example of the SAGE project that has been mentioned in this discussion. It was brought to our attention in very strong language at the time, sometime during the pandemic, how some people were not able to access social benefits because of the fact that they were not identified. When we sat down with the SAGE team, we realized that out of the 52,000 who were identified as not having access to the benefit, 44,000 had a national identification number, but did not have but had challenges with the information that had been gathered. So in essence, they were identified. However, they were contesting their information. So we agreed with a project that, look, if somebody is identified, the controversy now is on their age. We can see them. We meet them every month. Let us serve them as we get to justify aspects about their age and other issues. So in essence, it was agreed let's serve these people because we meet them every month. That is an example of the openness to addressing the problems can help surmount some of the problems. Then we also agree that since the SAGE teams meet these groups every month, we can share with them infrastructure to capture these groups, and the 11,000 will be captured. Right now, I think we're at 7,000. The next example is a project that I found had been undertaken, which is the Learners Project. The Learners Project set out to look at children, specifically below the age of 16. So there are different efforts that have been made towards inclusion. And yes, they do have challenges that I can't deny, but let us look at how we can address these challenges. Digitalization did not start with identity, but because of the benefits of digitalization, identity has now adopted digitalization. The question, therefore, is not if we need digitalization in identification, but is how do we address the challenges of the 33%? And some of them transcend digitalization of identification.
In fact, Rosemary, I want to, first of all, commend you for the transparency and the openness, for having agreed to come in this forum, knowing that this was not going to be basically a forum where people are going to say, wonderful, you've done, you brought within the system tens of millions of people, but you're going to be criticized for the fact that there are still people who are missing. I think that's the model that I would like to see, and I'd like to encourage all the other identity authorities in Africa to say, we're working together. We are going to work with the civil society. We hear you, and we're going to work with you. Please work with us, understand our challenges, help us see where there are pockets of challenge that are still remaining, because I believe everyone has to come to the table and work together for success. Ultimately, there's only one goal, and all of you agree on it, and that's the goal of inclusion, making sure everybody who has a right is able to exercise that right. So I thank you, Rosemary, for that, but I also want to say that your participation with us in this forum is not just limited to this session. We have agreed, and I will reveal that on the 26th of January, you are going to be coming back to do an Eye on Africa episode to share with us and the world all the accomplishments that have been done and the challenges that remain, and your vision for total inclusion. So I think—
Thank you, Dr. Atick. I forgot that. I forgot that. But we will be coming back, and I promise you that by that time, I will have linked up with Dorothy, and I would have linked up with the team from New York and did the study to understand how can we partner to improve inclusion. Because I'm sure among the people that were interviewed in these reports were people who don't have Ndagamuntu or a national identification number. And I need to distinguish the two. And the card from the identification number. Some people have an identification number, but don't have a card. But that doesn't mean they're not identified. But more importantly, imagine if at the time of interview, we had partnered to enroll such people. It would have been a very strong partnership in that we would have had an interview from a person who has not been included. And at the point at which they're sharing their pain, they are being included.
Yeah.
So we have a role to play in which we, instead of looking at just the challenges, how can we partner in light of the challenges to address them in the real instant? So I will definitely reach out to the civil society group and see how together we can, at the time they interview those, because the resources that were taken to interview those who are not included could have actually been leveraged to include them.
Excellent. I mean, I'll say to civil society listening, you've heard it here. Rosemary Kisembo has, in total transparency and openness, is willing to dialogue with you with the objective of making lives better for everyone involved. So let's be positive. Let's engage in a positive dialogue. The door is open. So we ran out of time. So I want to thank you again. I know it's late in your time. Thank you again for being with us. And we look forward to a much longer session in the Eye on Africa segment on January 26th. So everyone, mark your calendars. Thank you so much. Okay, we are going to continue with more inspiration from the field, understanding how exclusion has been overcome. We are going to have 3 brief presentations, essentially little case studies from organizations that have dealt with exclusion and turned exclusion into inclusion. So what have they done, how they've done it, how they've achieved it. Let us start with Janaina Costa from IDS Brazil. The forum is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Atick. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll go with my presentation. I'm going to start to share my screen. Voila. Everyone can see my screen?
Yes.
The presentation? Yes, great. So, my name is Janaina Costa. I'm a lawyer and a senior researcher at the Institute of Technology and Society. I work there for 3 years now, and the ITS have been in the forefront for technology and study the impacts of technology in human rights in the life of people. So what I want to show to you today, it's I hope an inspiration for you all, but I have to start with a little bit of context. So Brazil is a large country, like continental dimensions, and we have more than 100 million inhabitants, and we unfortunately marked by deep regional inequalities. In a country, 1 in 4 citizens over 10 years old do not have internet access, and 1 on 3 adults do not have access to banking services. And that's it, without saying that we have other very relevant nuance of digital literacy and data package costs, but in view of our short presentation here today, I won't go into it. My aim here is to present the challenge of assisting the most severe impact population in a context of pandemic in Brazil and the social isolation context also, and how digital identity shall be understood as both a solution and a challenge in Brazil. As I will try to convey to you all, even to the portion of the population with access to the internet and appropriate device, the challenge of provide digital government service is enormous. And despite that Brazil is advancing in digital service and towards a digital identity system, it was clear that the country at the time was not quite ready for the task. But we are also here to identify the root causes of exclusion and to discuss and share ways to overcome them. So I hope to contribute to this panel with a solid example of a public policy implementing the state of Rio de Janeiro that can help in this endeavor. So the Auxílio Emergencial is the name of the main financial aid program in Brazil, made for the federal government and rolled out to transfer cash benefits during the COVID-19 crisis, and also to help to mitigate the virus socioeconomic impacts. The program provides monthly payments to existing welfare beneficiaries, but also to new users, including formal workers, informal workers, and individuals in vulnerable groups. The government plan was to pay financial aid to up to 75 million citizens, but reach them was a major task. So during the early stages of the COVID-19 crisis, the Brazilian government launched 2 apps to help get financial aid to those citizens in a remote manner. So we have here the 2 apps. The first one is Auxílio Emergencial app, and the second one on your right is the Caixa Tem. So both of them are run by the Caixa Econômica Federal, the largest state-owned bank in Latin America, and one of the main banks responsible for all the welfare payments in Brazil. So these 2 apps, they work separately. So the first one, the Auxílio Emergencial, it's used for applying to receive the financial benefit from the federal government. And the Caixa Tem app in the right, it's used to receive the cash transfers via a digital savings account. So they are nonetheless complementary. The Auxílio Emergencial is to register, and the Caixa Tem to receive the funds if your application is accepted. So one of the main problems here, I don't know if you can see well in the PowerPoint presentation, but in the second line of both apps, you can see that's applying for the financial aid or to get the bank account, you need to prove the provision of the taxpayer ID, what's called in Brazil the CPF. It's similar to a social security number. So the requirement for providing a CPF was extended to all family members that could affect the amount of the financial aid. For example, in the case of additional aid allowance provided to single mothers. So to get the savings account, you also have to insert your CPF number. So as I will describe in a minute, the requirement of a valid CPF number, the social security number, for almost all the beneficiaries of this aid has created an exclusionary barrier. So here we see just 3 weeks after the app's release, that was in April 2020, it was known that several benefits were denied due to outdated identity records. So there is actually not estimated a number of citizens impacted by mandatory use of the social security number per se, but considering here in the graphic in the left, you can see that 95 million users applied to receive the benefit, and consider the estimated payment due to 75 million eligible citizens. And at the end of these 3 weeks, only 50 million received financial aid. So it's likely that the mandatory use of the CPF, the social security number, had a major impact here. So the policy, we should highlight that the policy did set some exceptions to the mandatory CPF provisions, but was only applicable to those already being granted welfare benefits without a reported and valid CPF. So in which case, the application through the emergency aid app was not necessary to receive the benefit. So what you see here in the right is that the main Brazilian welfare register system, the CADE Único, had records for only 37% of these people eligible to the financial aid, so equivalent to 27 million people. All other users have to use the Auxílio Emergencial app to apply, go through a government-run triage, and if approved, use the Caixa Tem app to create an analysis account and get the aid. So it's worth remembering that the online process, exclusive way, both to have access to the financial aid and to apply or to regularize your CPF number, may pose digital barriers worth considering, such as access to the internet, mobile phones, and digital literacy. So there is no estimate of a number of citizens who were denied access due to the digital barrier. However, the number of queues that we could see of people seeking help to use these apps at the CaixaBank physical office was notorious. Here you can see all the identities, formal identities that we have in Brazil rolling out on this GIF. So you can see I'm talking about this intricate system of identification in Brazil. So this is shown to use the ITS information map. It's a project of ours that's an online interactive and open map that systematically shows the main elements of the entire bureaucratic ecosystem that's formed in Brazil around the identity of the citizen in our country. With the birth registration document, the civil birth registration, the individual has access to the other basic documents of a Brazilian citizen that are interdependent on each other. It's a chain, such as a identity card, so the CPF number, our social security number, voter registration, and work permit. So in other words, without a birth certificate, it's not possible to obtain a CPF, and without a CPF, it's not possible to obtain a work permit. So you see the exclusions in chain in our system. So, well, as you can see, in the absence of all these documents, access to medical care, education, formal work, and government social work programs is not possible. So as a CPF, the social security number in Brazil, is being used as a unique national identification number in Brazil, they need to have a CPF, specifically in the case of welfare benefits paid to vulnerable groups, may result in this important barrier. So all this is to get you the context to get where this broken link that we need to address. So we must identify where the identification chain breaks, rather than creating new registers. Policymakers should consider rethink the existing administrative records and mainly the identification system. So we can see here as I showed you, that Brazil still faces serious problem of inclusion in the traditional identification system. So the Brazilian Institute of Geography, the IBGE, estimates that at least 3 million people had no civil birth registration in Brazil in 2018. So this has serious consequences for the exercise of the citizenship. So among the main barriers that the survey identified, we can highlight that distance from the register office. So there is a time and travel constraint to go to get a register. Also, absence of register office in some municipalities, so we have to travel to another city to get a registration. And I can see also that undocumented adults, so late birth registration, it's still have a barrier of stigmatization. Notably, the most vulnerable people, they don't feel comfortable to go into the courthouse because they have a dress code. They feel that's overly formal space for them and they don't belong there. So what do you think, what do you have to remember here? So how do we overcome exclusion? So I argue that we have to have a multi-channel access in parallel with digital access inclusion policies, as well aim to overcome the gap in the traditional identification system. So the inclusion of those who do not have yet access to a legal identification and or CPF, for example, which are requirements to participate in the digital identification system that is being outlined in Brazil. So to get registration in the digital identification system in Brazil, you're gonna need to have a CPF. So you need to address that first, right? So here we have in the right a photo of the queue in front of the One Caixa Bank office to obtain this financial system and to get help how to use the app. So we see how digital inclusion policies are quite important too. Whoops, and back. And now the bright side, I'm going to show you a very successful example. That's the Justiça Itinerante. It's a mobile justice that goes to the citizen and brings justice closer to the citizen. So in 2004, in order to facilitate access to justice, a fundamental right provided for the Brazilian Constitution, a constitutional amendment called Constitutional Amendment number 45 determined that the federal and state courts would install itinerant justice, the mobile justice, with the holding of hearings and other functions of the justice branch to public and community facilities. So this policy emerged as a paradigm for jurisdictional provision with judges, representatives from the parquet, and also public defender's office. They could reach out to citizens, especially those most in need. So the aim here is to enable access to justice for those living in places where there are no courthouses, population that cannot travel for hours to seek their rights. In Rio, it started with only 2 buses that were donated to the state. And today we have more than 7 buses in work and operation offering services in 26 regular stations and other stations too that are not fixed, but depending on the demand. So the initial goal here, as I can show to you, was over the years expanded the program, and reach out to more permanent posts and have also in regions that in communities with difficult access and security problems, like it's known in Brazil as favelas. And in 2008, the service for the eradication of under-registration and search for certificates was created with the purpose of expediting legal process involving under-registration. So when you have all of these 2 projects together was in 2014, that was the inauguration of the itinerant justice specialized in the eradication of under-registration. So we call ônibus do subregistro. The civil registration service with a focus on this late birth registration. So we extended to all itinerant, all the mobile justice service locations. But every Friday, the civil registration bus specialized on the late birth registration works in a fixed location in the city center of the capital of Rio de Janeiro. And in a minute, I will show you the impacts of this. So what this mobile just have already impacted in Brazil? A lot. You can show that it's a really successful combination of services in Brazil, showcased by the Rio de Janeiro. So through these adapted buses, the Internet Justice Program has already reached the milestone of more than 1.2 million services provided in the state of Rio de Janeiro since this creation in 2004. until November 2020. And the under registration specialized bus alone, fixing the capital, I told you in the square, in the city center capital, has provided more than 26,000 services since its creation in 2014. So what I want to, just to wrap it up, is just this kind of approach. The bus is more approachable, so you can see the bus in the street, so the citizens feel that they can go there. You can see for the photos, they don't have to be a dress code. They feel comfortable to get in there and get their date birth registration. And this could also be scaled to help deploy digital identity systems also, and help people with digital literacy and internet access difficulties, for example. Thank you so much, Dr. Atick.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I love it. In fact, this mobile justice initiative where you're going to the people is actually something that would address what we've heard in the beginning in the documentary. But literate people sometimes may get intimidated going into buildings that are official. When they see the bus coming, it makes the government more familiar, easier to approach. And this program of eradication of under registration is a wonderful, wonderful initiative that we should all be looking at. We hope to talk to you again sometime soon to see how the progress is happening. But in the meantime, thank you for this inspirational presentation. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you.
My pleasure. We're
going to now bring in someone from Namati, but actually Mustafa Mahmoud from Namati, welcome for being with us. I'd like to talk to you about some of the work that you're doing and some of the successes that you've done. But I'd like to start this by showing a 1-minute clip from your own production.
And Namati believes in community advocacy, whereby the communities are empowered on how to claim their rights. So Namati Citizenship Program works with partners in Kenya. One of our partners is based in Nairobi, the Nubian Rights Forum. And another partner is based in Wajir, Paranet, or also called Heralding Development Organization. Another partner is based in Garissa, Haki na Sheria. And the other partner works at the coast, mainly Kilifi, Kwale, and Mombasa, and that is Haki Center. So we believe in giving the community the tools to know the law, to use the law, and when the laws are not working for them, they get to know the avenues on how do you change the law. And when they realize that the system is not working for them, they're also trained on how to do advocacy in terms of writing petition to parliament, participating in legislation, so that they can also be able to change laws that are not working for them.
Excellent. Excellent. Mustafa, how do you scale this good work? What do you need in order to create even more impact? You've been doing wonderful work, and Namati has been doing wonderful work. What does it take to scale it?
Just to say, it's a coincidence that the shirt that I wore in the documentary is the same that I've worn today. But anyway, for us to be able to scale the work is to use the approach of a community-led advocacy model. And for us, how we achieve this is by using paralegals, who we train them on the process and the law. And if we could be able to have more donors to look at this in the angle of human rights, because identity rights is the right to have rights. If you don't have the right to belong, if you don't belong in a country, then you are non-existent. You cannot have social, political, economic rights. So if the moment we realize that this is the basic rights, that any system, is it a right to health, has an approach of having paralegals who could train people on how to get documentation, who could train people to realize the gaps in laws and how it could be improved. Then we could scale it up internationally and nationally and all that. But our approach is the one that really empowers people to realize that we cannot have a paralegal per person. But if we empower these communities can be able to sustain these projects so that they can be able to know, when I give birth to another child, what is the age of registration for a birth certificate? When I reach the age of 18, what is the requirement for me to get an ID? So when you get one paralegal within a community, you train them to be able to train other people on the requirement, on the process. And in the long term is to change the system. If you realize that the paralegals have been addressing a certain issue, how do you tackle the issue, for example, the issue of exclusion in the long term, so that we don't have continuous advocacy? We need to solve the problem. And the way we look at solving the problem is through data collection. Our paralegals do not only empower people, they also collect the data on the ground on what is the requirement, what process are you going through, how long does it take, so that at the end of it all, it becomes data-driven advocacy, that you say, we have seen this number of people are excluded based on the fact that they have to go through differential treatment in terms of the burdensome proof, in terms of waiting period, in terms of questions asked, in terms of the fact that only some people, for example, if I give an example in Kenya, communities that we work with, for example, the Nubians, can only apply in 2 days of the week, on Monday and Thursday. And the fact that they can only apply on 2 days, it means it's differential treatment. The other people can apply on any day. In other parts, for example, when in the video you've seen, we work in northeastern Kenya, Garissa and Wajir. These people can only apply once in 9 months, where the vetting committee comes to your village. So it means if you don't get it this month of November, you have to wait until 9 months from now. So the fact that you need an ID card to join a university, and you've maybe excelled in high school and you need to join university, the moment you've not applied for it this year and you wait for next year, that's already 1 year of your academic year that is gone. So basically, if we use this data-driven approach, we can be able to drive the government to a change. We can also be able to identify these gaps quickly.
Now, I like this data-driven advocacy. What is the channel by which your results are communicated to the government? Are you able to get direct access, or are you relying on publishing and then waiting for them to read what you're doing? How do you engage with the authorities?
We've been able to, through the statelessness campaign to end statelessness, the 10 years campaign to end statelessness, Namati and partners have been sitting with a task force of the government to work around issues of ending statelessness and also avoiding the occurrence of statelessness. And exclusion is one of the causes of statelessness. So through this, we've been able to have advocacy roundtables. We've been able to have successes. Some of our partners have really done tremendous work. For example, in 2017, we were able to register a stateless community, which basically they didn't belong. And because of the advocacy, because we were able to sit down with the government and told them this community cannot access any document from a birth certificate to an ID. And the laws basically gave us a room to registration of stateless people. So through that, we were able to have an advocacy meeting and table the proposal of registration. And it didn't just come overnight. The fact that the communities also had to match. For example, the Makonde community had to march from Kwale to Nairobi in protest just to get audience. So the civil society was in the round table, but the community also had an approach whereby the community were told, you are the change makers. You are the only ones who can push for this change. So they marched and they were given the audience by the president. It was 600 kilometers walk, you can imagine.
Yeah. Actually, Mustafa, what would you recommend or give advice to other civil societies? You've succeeded. And so what advice do you give to other civil societies for how to approach this problem so that they can also achieve success where you have succeeded while they have failed in several contexts? What does it take to become a change maker?
I think my advice will be first, a civil society most of the times we take up action on behalf of communities. I want to tell the civil societies it's about time to give the communities the tools to change themselves. It's about time to tell the communities, how do you do community-driven approach? You empower them on the laws. What are the laws? What are the gaps? How do you address it? Let them take the leadership of all this. Once you've already empowered them, let them take the center stage. You can be more like giving them the shadow, accompanying them, because sometimes all someone needs is to know that there's someone walking the walk with them. The other thing that I will urge civil society, for years we've been talking about we are being discriminated. There's exclusion, but do you have the statistics around it? And what is the nature of the exclusion? For example, for us, we can talk about geographical exclusion, where people are far from the registration centers. We can talk about linguistic inclusion, the exclusion, because we've seen people being excluded because of this. So how many are these people? What is the nature? And what is the gravity of this? So basically, if we could go the data approach, whereby we show information on who are these people, where are they located, and what is the nature, we can be able to give the audience, get the audience from the government. Because at the end of it all, when you're told who are these people, and you say it's a research, it's a research of how many people, where are they based, and all that.
Yeah, I really like your approach, Namati's approach of data-driven advocacy, because it's very easy to sensationalize and create headlines. But in fact, we need to work together and drive decisions based on facts on the ground. And you've managed to connect with the communities, and therefore you have access to data. You're not sitting somewhere in a foreign capital imagining things. You're on the ground and seeing the challenges and actually collecting data so you can inform policy. Mustafa, any closing words you have? But we are going to have you again. We've used several of your material and videos today. We thank you for that. I'll give you the chance to give us any closing wisdom.
My closing remark is we cannot fight digital ID, but basically we should learn from the current identity regimes. What is failing? How can we improve it? And we come from the lesson point and not resisting. For example, if we come with approaches of saying there are communities who are excluded, how do we include them so that we move forward as one country? Because most of the times when we roll out a digital ID, for example, in Kenya, the prerequisite was the current identity regime. And the current identity regime is already excluding people. Could we be able to resolve existing situations before we roll out the new identity cards so that everybody feels like they're on the same level while we're transitioning? So at the end of it all, when you're looking at transitioning, we should look at transitioning to digital ID that is inclusive, that is not going to leave out anybody. And also, these identity regimes should be cognizant of the fact that the old identity regime had errors. How do you allow people to correct existing errors? For example, I'll give you, if we get another opportunity, we'll give you examples of communities who are affected by the refugee camps. For example, the biggest refugee camps are in Kenya, Dadaab refugee camp and Kakuma. We have over 40,000 people because of drought were registered in the UNHCR database, and now they are stuck in the database. They cannot be Kenyans and they cannot be Somalis or Sudanese because basically they were Kenyans who were desperate, went for food at young ages. How are you able to allow people to be able to correct those errors that were done so that they can be able to transition together? So we should be alive that the databases have errors, and we should be alive to humans make mistakes and allow them to correct those mistakes. So I think we should, we deserve to have another opportunity to have an in-depth conversation on this. And I look forward to another invitation.
We would love to, Thank you for your words of wisdom. Thank you. Sorry, we have a limited time. Now we want to talk last but not least, in fact, about the wisdom of dealing with vulnerable population. In fact, one important vulnerable population group is the migrants and the people who are on the move, either because of natural causes or political causes, and therefore they are forced to cross borders. In fact, they are at a point where if they are excluded, it could be a question of life and death for them. And therefore, we want to know about measures that the IOM tries to put in place in order to ensure that no one falls through the cracks of the borders and no one is lost in the process. So with us here, Cy Winter, the forum is yours. Thank you for being with us and thank you for your patience.
Very much, Dr. Atick. It's a pleasure to be here. A very interesting discussion. I'll just share the screen overall.
Okay.
How's that? Can you see that?
Yes, we can see it. Perfect.
Okay, well, I have a disclaimer as well. This is my presentation. It doesn't necessarily represent the use of IOM, but it is based on over time, and prior to that with the U.S. Embassy Refugee Program out of Thailand. So as in my background, over the past 30 years, we've had all kinds of developments with identifying migrants and refugees. And to me, the most important thing to do is to make sure that the state registers the person, that there's a point when there's a photographic and capture of the basic bio and the individual is connected with the state. All too often we see situations where informal migration and informal economies act as a kind of synergy where they work together, and it's easier not to arrest people and deport them because you know they've got a role in the economy. But then the economy is informal, it's difficult to formalize it, and it becomes this negative synergy that has a lot of very positive aspects. So, and work towards changing that economic, those economic drivers individually so that people are interested in getting registered and governments are interested in registering them. And it can be done at a very, very basic level. And this goes, I think, a lot to what the first panel was saying. When you go in to deal with a new population, I always look at these three factors to get a sense of what level of order exists. Is there good security? Are the police operating under law? Is there protection for people who are vulnerable or who have been hurt? And can everybody who's walking around produce some kind of a document that shows who they are so that they can interact and the government can interact with them? Those three factors all have influences on each other. And you can't really expect one to go much higher than the other. It's a three-legged stool on which order sits. And so when one goes up too high or is too out of whack, like these security elements or any kind of discriminatory or those kinds of problems, you need to understand what they are and what economic motivations can be in play to try and reverse that or improve it. So that's a very simplistic perspective description, but I think it really works when you're trying to understand something quickly. This is the bird's eye view of what we're seeing. Okay, we have the border management system with our international civil aviation documents on the upper left, and this is this goose that lays the golden eggs. That's the global travel system. We have standardized documents, standardized systems that allow countries to rapidly move millions of people in and out of borders all around the world. On the other side, we have the shadow population that's moving irregularly. It might be a cross-border population, it might be long-distance migration, but these people are moving irregularly across the borders for various reasons. It's either protection or it's economic, etc. Those people have certain level of ability to identify themselves. Sometimes they may only have a story, they may not have anything, but they usually have something on them. And it's very important to understand what that something is and what it can prove. And then what skill set do the officials need in order to review these cases, establish identity, and put the person over into what is a orderly migration path and get them properly registered into a system. Ideally, you use something very similar to the border management system because the immigration authorities are accustomed to it. So in every scenario, we always assess what the border management system capabilities are, because it can usually make a nice registration program. And then you have your reports. This is kind of what it looks like. You know, there's the outreach. You have our shadow population. We need to understand what they need. We need to understand what the government's going to need. And then we do our outreach. We see who comes in. We see what the problems are with the people who are not coming in. We see what adjustments need to be made. Policy, politics, all that is involved. It needs to be negotiated. And then continue the outreach and make adjustments to get more and more people into the process. How do we do that? I recommend highly starting at the front line, working with the frontline officials who deal with people on a day-to-day basis. We organize technical exchanges with them to see what it is that they do given various scenarios and cases. We have different samples of the documents that the people can produce, different types of cases. You know, mom has a passport that's expired. Dad is in another country, but he sends these letters with these pictures. The kids all look alike, but this one kid might look a little different. And what are we going to do with all that? How do we assess children who don't have photo IDs? All of those things need to be looked at. Social workers and civil society can play an important role in these teams. So then you start really understanding what's working and what's not and why, and what skill set do we need to build for the officials? Who do we need to train with what capability? And it's critical also to understand what's in the legislation, what's in the regulation, what's in the actual policy of the directorate. Because a lot of times you'll find out, hey, you know, that valid passport thing, that's actually regulated. A ministerial signature could just say any document of so-and-so characteristic would be adequate. So it's understanding the nitty-gritty details of what it is that's required and why under law, regulation, procedures to come up with your advocacy plan for different cases. And you have to do it in a very neutral perspective, because there's a lot of security considerations, but there's a lot of human rights and protection considerations. So you need to sit down with a, as you're doing right here, Dr. Atick, you need to sit down with a team that has that equal balance and get them to review these cases and come up with a way forward so that you can start bringing the individuals into the fold of the identity solution. So I know we don't have a lot of time. This is my last slide. These are the four areas that IOM really wants to focus on: consular services, migrants who can't produce the adequate identity documents, overall national civil registration, and the nexus between migration, displacement, legal identity, and the impact for the protection of migrants. So that's my closing presentation for you. I hope it's okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, actually, if I make a few remarks, what you've raised is something that we as the international identity community or the international development community needs to focus on, is that the understanding that identity registration is not always about enrollment and registering formalized and well-defined identity. It might become identity investigation or identity intelligence. I mean, you have to be able to make a judgment to decide if there is evidence of identity that can support the proof that this person claiming to be who they claim to be. And the question I have—
photo right here. That's a
right,
photo
exactly.
right.
Exactly. I mean, you've got
That's
to
what
be
he's doing. Those
exactly.
people do not have any documents whatsoever.
Right.
It's a story.
And we cannot fall in the trap of saying, unless you have document, you don't exist. The fact is they do exist. So we have to help them prove their case. Let me ask you, what is going to be required to turn this into a science instead of an art? I mean, we don't want, Colombo to be the one running every one of these investigations. We want one more thing. No, we want basically a science. How do we go about doing that? Are there organizations that are building toolkits and training modules that can allow more and more investigators to join and help turn exclusion into inclusion?
Yeah, well, we have a gentleman at IOM who's heading up our identity, legal identity strategy, who I think you need to talk to. We've seen across the institution various capabilities, and I'm talking about the UN team in general, UNHCR, IOM, UNICEF, the World Bank, where you have some skill sets there that can be consolidated into what is standardized practices.
Right.
to ensure that people who may not be refugees, but who can establish their identity through the normal means. So how do we build the skill sets so that those people can rapidly be processed and that it's not easier to just forget about them?
Yeah, I mean, ICAO's working groups have also been working to develop standards in this area. It's been a long process. It's been a long time coming. It's not an easy challenge, but I think case management technology could help in creating the ability to resolve and create evidence for identity that goes beyond just simply having a piece of paper or some document, official document from the government. I'd love to continue this. I'd love to continue this discussion. We've run out of time, so I'm going to thank you, Sai, for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon. And for the rest of the audience, I would say thank you all for having joined us in this episode. You can see what I said in the beginning. This is a difficult subject. It can be divisive. It has been at some point, but the intention is not to create divisions. The intention is to overcome them, to find ways to turn exclusion into inclusion, to promote a positive dialogue so that we can avoid negative outcomes. I was very impressed with the executive director of Uganda, of NIRA Uganda. She's taken the step to come to the table and say, we have nothing to hide. We hear you. We want to work with you. This is a wonderful example that I hope we can emulate across not just Africa, but across the world. Governments should be accountable. Civil society should be working in the interest of people to make sure that either intentionally or unintentionally, the government practices are not leaving people behind. And that's the commitment that we bring to the table as ID for Africa, as an organization that believes in empowering the people. And we believe only through a multi-stakeholder dialogue are we able to overcome these challenges. I invite you to stay with us and come back to part 2 of this trilogy, where we continue examining the challenges that we have to overcome together. And with that, I close the part 1 of the trilogy, and I wish you a wonderful evening, a wonderful day, wherever you are. Thank you.